Welcome, dear listener, and allow yourself to settle now, gently and without hurry, into whatever soft place has chosen to hold you tonight. Loosen your shoulders, soften your jaw. Let the weight of the day slip from your fingertips like fine grains of sand returning quietly to the earth. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember, nothing that requires your attention in this slow, golden hour. Tonight we will travel together, slowly and softly, to a place where time itself seems to drift like candlelight upon polished marble. We are going to the Palace of Versailles, not as tourists with cameras and quickened steps, but as quiet wanderers who arrive long after the crowds have departed, long after the great wrought-iron gates have whispered closed for the evening, long after the gilded fountains have stilled their silvery song. Imagine, if you will, the soft hush of twilight settling over the gardens. The rose beds breathe out their last warm fragrance of the day, mingling with the cool mossy scent of fountain stones. Single lantern flickers somewhere along a distant terrace, its small flame painting trembling shapes upon the gravel. We are slipping in through a hidden side door, the kind history rarely speaks of, the kind kings and chambermaids once shared in equal secrecy. There are corridors here that few have walked, rooms behind rooms, stairways behind tapestries, and tonight, gently, slowly, room by room, they are about to open softly for you alone. Before we wander any deeper into these whispering corridors, before we lift the heavy velvet curtain that conceals the first hidden passage, take just one slow breath with me. Through the nose, soft and unhurried. Out through the mouth, like mist drifting from a winter window. Good. If you find your shoulders sinking a little lower, your eyelids growing pleasantly heavy, then perhaps these quiet journeys are becoming a familiar comfort to you. If that is so, you might consider, gently and only when it suits you, tapping the small subscribe symbol beneath this lantern-lit story. It is a quiet gesture, no louder than a turning page, and it allows these soft histories to find you again on other restless evenings. You may also tap the little bell you wish, so that whenever a new candle is lit in this corner of the world, you will hear its faint, faraway chime. There is no rush, no fanfare, only an invitation, soft as the rustle of silk along a polished floor. For now, let your hand rest. Let your thoughts settle like falling petals upon still water. The Palace of Versailles is waiting, patient as marble, ageless as moonlight on glass. Its secret stairways and forgotten chambers have stood through revolutions, through silences, through centuries of slow dust. They will wait a moment longer while you breathe, while you soften, while you allow yourself at last to be carried gently into the long, sweet, drifting history of the night. The path that leads us toward the palace is not a path of stone alone, but a path of memory, paved with the slow accumulation of footsteps, of carriage wheels, of soft leather slippers and sturdy gardener's boots, of 3 full centuries of arrivals and quiet departures. Beneath our feet, the cobblestones glisten faintly with the last damp residue of an evening shower, each rounded stone catching the wavering reflection of a lantern, each small puddle holding within it a perfect, trembling miniature of the rising moon. The air smells faintly of wet limestone and the green vegetal sweetness of clipped boxwood hedges, that particular scent which seems to belong only to old European gardens at dusk, when the warmth of the day has lifted but the leaves still breathe out their slow exhalations of chlorophyll and earth. Ahead of us rise the famous golden gates, those tall, intricate barriers wrought from black iron and crowned with shimmering layers of fine, hammered gold leaf. By daylight they blaze with such brilliance that visitors must shield their eyes, but at this hour, in this hush, they have softened to something far more intimate, a deep, slumbering bronze touched here and there with gentle highlights where the lantern light pools against the carved fleurs-de-lis, against the royal sun emblem, against the elaborate scrollwork of grapes and laurel that climbs each vertical bar. Run your gaze slowly along one of those bars. Notice how the iron is not perfectly smooth, but bears the faint hammer marks of the 18th century smiths who shaped it, each tiny indentation a fingerprint of labour, a small permanent record of a hand long since returned to dust. The gold leaf itself, when one is permitted close enough to examine it, is unimaginably thin, thinner than the wing of a moth, thinner than a whisper, and it has been pressed onto the iron with the gentlest of tools, with squirrel hair brushes and breath and patience, layer upon layer, generation upon generation. The Gilders of Versailles were a quiet brotherhood, working in workshops tucked into the palace outbuildings, their fingers stained yellow, their eyes squinting in the soft light of north-facing windows. They spoke little while they worked, for a single sneeze, a single sudden draught, could send a leaf of gold drifting away into the air, irretrievable, lost forever to a crack between the floorboards. Beyond the gates, the great forecourt opens like the palm of an enormous stone hand, vast and pale and faintly luminous beneath the moon. The cobbles here are larger, rougher, set in long radiating arcs that draw the eye irresistibly toward the central facade of the palace itself. Walk slowly across them now. In your imagination, and listen, you can almost hear, layered beneath the silence, the faint ghostly clatter of carriage wheels, the soft clopping of horses' hooves, the distant calling of footmen, the rustle of taffeta gowns being lifted carefully clear of the damp. All of it has happened here, exactly where you walk, and all of it has settled into the stones like rainwater, into mossy crevices, present still but quiet, very quiet. The palace itself rises before us now, longer than the eye can comfortably hold in a single glance. Its facade stretches outward to the left and right in a great pale embrace, the limestone of its walls washed to a soft cream by the centuries, marked here and there by the gentle weathering of rain and wind, be faint dark streaks beneath each window where decades of slow drips have traced their patient courses. The windows themselves number in the hundreds, perhaps the thousands, each one tall and narrow and crowned with a delicate keystone carved into the likeness of a sun or a cherub or a bundle of laurel leaves. By night only a handful of these windows glow, their soft amber light suggesting the presence of a sleeping caretaker perhaps, or the steady burn of a lamp left lit before some particular painting. Above the central section of the facade, the slate roof rises in a dark undulating mass, punctuated by the chimneys that once channeled the smoke of 1,000 small fires up into the Parisian sky. Imagine those chimneys in the deep winter of long ago, each one breathing its pale plume into the freezing night, a silent forest of warmth rising from the sleeping court below. Imagine the slate tiles themselves, hand-cut, each one slightly different from its neighbour, fitted by men who climbed the steep pitches with rope harnesses and small leather mallets, calling softly to one another over the dizzying drop. Pause for a moment now, let your gaze drift downward along the facade to the row of statues that line the rooftop balustrade. They are gods and goddesses mostly, figures from the old myths, each one frozen in some attitude of grace or reflection, their stone hair tousled by an eternal wind. By day they are simply ornaments, by night, when the moon rises behind them, they become silhouettes, dark cut-paper figures against the pale, milky sky, and one can almost imagine them turning their heads ever so slightly to watch you pass below. The great central avenue that approaches the palace is flanked on either side by enormous lanterns mounted on tall, spiralling iron posts. The glass of these lanterns is faintly clouded with age and weather, and the candles within them burn with a gentle, hesitant flicker, as though each small flame were itself a sleepy creature curling upon its wick. The light they cast is not the cold, certain light of a modern bulb, but something softer, warmer, more patient, the kind of light that does not banish darkness so much as keep it polite and respectful at a comfortable distance. The smells of the courtyard at this hour are layered and quiet. There is the faint, mineral scent of damp stone, of course, and beneath it the green breath of the gardens beyond. But there is also something subtler, a lingering trace of horse and leather and old saddle soap from the great stables that flank the palace to either side. Even now, long after the royal carriages have ceased their thunderous arrivals, that scent has soaked into the very pores of the buildings, and it rises softly on humid evenings like this one, a quiet ghost of an older, busier age. Mingled with it, perhaps, you might catch a thread of wood smoke from some distant chimney, or the faint perfume of jasmine drifting from a hidden garden bed, or the cool, almost metallic freshness of fountain water. Take one more slow breath here, in the great forecourt, before we move closer to the palace doors. Feel the broadness of the space around you, the high openness of the night sky, the patient stillness of the buildings on every side. There is no urgency. The palace will not vanish if we linger. The stars above us, faint and steady, are the same stars that shone upon Louis XIV as he gazed from his window long ago, the same stars that will shine here long after we have gone. There is something deeply restful in that thought, isn't there? The persistence of small lights, the patience of stone, the slow, slow turning of a world that does not for once require anything of you at all. The great central doors of the palace, when at last we approach them, do not open with the grand theatrical sweep one might imagine. They yield instead with a long, low sigh, a soft exhalation of cool air from within, as though the building itself were drawing a slow, patient breath after the long warmth of the day. The wood of these doors is oak, ancient and dense, darkened by 3 centuries of polish and the soft caress of countless passing hands. Lean close, if you would, and let your fingertips graze the surface. You will feel beneath them not the smoothness of new lacquer, but the gentle topography of age, the faint ridges where the grain has lifted and settled, the small, almost invisible scars where some careless buckle or sword hilt brushed too firmly long ago. Each mark is a syllable in a story too long to ever be fully told. Beyond the threshold, the vestibule opens around us, and here we must pause, for the space asks for pausing. The floor beneath our feet is laid in great squares of black and white marble, arranged in the classical checkerboard pattern that the architects of the 17th century so adored. The black squares are not truly black, but a deep, velvety bluish grey, quarried from the cold cliffs of Belgium and shipped southward in heavy wagons over the rutted roads of a younger Europe. The white squares, by contrast, are warmer, a creamy ivory shot through with faint silvery veins, drawn from the quarries of Carrara in Italy, the same beloved stone from which Michelangelo once liberated his sleeping figures. Walk slowly across these squares. Listen to the soft hollow tap your imagined footsteps make, that particular sound which only marble produces, a sound at once crisp and somehow muffled, as though each note were padded by the centuries of footsteps that came before. The marble is cool, perpetually cool, regardless of the season outside. In the swelter of August, when the gardens beyond shimmer with heat, this floor remains as cool as a riverbed in spring. In January, when frost rimes the window panes and the chimneys breathe out their pale smoke, the marble grows colder still, cold enough that the courtiers of long ago wore thick-soled slippers and woolen stockings to cross from one room to another. The masons who laid these stones knew their craft well. Each square was set by hand into a thin bed of lime mortar, then tapped gently into place with a wooden mallet wrapped in soft leather to prevent any unsightly bruise or chip. The seams between the stones are so fine, so meticulously aligned, that even now, after all these years, a coin laid flat upon the floor can scarcely find a crack into which to slip. Lift your eyes slowly, slowly toward the ceiling above us. The vestibule is not a tall room by the standards of this palace, but it possesses a quiet dignity of proportion, a sense of having been built by someone who understood that the first impression of any great house should be one of welcome rather than intimidation. The ceiling is divided into shallow coffered panels, each one painted a soft, dusty blue, the precise shade one finds in the early morning sky just before the sun crests the horizon. Within each coffer a small painted rosette blooms in muted gold, no larger than the palm of a child's hand, and these rosettes catch the lantern light in faint intermittent winks, like distant fireflies suspended in some impossible upside-down meadow. Around us the walls are clad in panels of pale grey marble, polished to such a degree of smoothness that they hold the reflection of the lantern flame as faithfully as still water holds the moon. Run your gaze along the lower portion of these walls, where the marble meets the floor in a softly curving baseboard. You will notice, if you look carefully, the faint scuff marks left by the heels of 1,000 passing courtiers, marks too gentle to disfigure the stone but nonetheless present, a patient archaeology of human passage. The footman of an earlier age polished these baseboards each morning with soft cotton cloths and a paste made from beeswax and oil of lemon, and the faint lingering ghost of that lemon scent still seems to hover here, bright and clean, against the deeper, older smell of the stone. In the very centre of the vestibule, suspended on a long iron chain from the painted ceiling, hangs a single great lantern. It is fashioned of thin sheets of horn, those translucent panels so prized in the days before clear glass became commonplace, and the candle flame within it glows with a strange warm amber light, like sunlight passing through a glass of dark honey. The lantern turns very slowly upon its chain, almost imperceptibly perhaps, stirred by the slow currents of warm and cool air that move through any old building. Watch it, just for a moment. Notice how its gentle rotation casts a slow, almost dreamlike procession of shadows across the marble walls, soft shapes that lengthen and shrink and dissolve again like thoughts at the edge of sleep. To either side of the vestibule, two arched openings lead onward into the palace proper. The arches are lined with delicate plaster mouldings, the kind of fine, sinuous work that the French call roquet, ornamentation that mimics the curves of seashells, the unfurling of fern fronds, the slow droop of grape clusters from a vine. These mouldings were modelled by hand, with small wooden tools and quick, certain gestures by craftsmen whose names have been entirely forgotten, and whose work, nonetheless, has outlasted empires. Pause beneath one of the arches. Notice how the plaster has aged here and there with the faintest blush of yellow, the patina that comes only from many, many years of soft candlelight and gentle smoke. The air in this vestibule is still, not perfectly still, for no air in any old building is ever truly motionless, but still in that particular weighted way that one finds in places where the human bustle has receded for the night. There is the faintest sense of movement, almost too subtle to name, as though the building itself were breathing in the slowest possible rhythm, exhaling the warmth absorbed through the daylight hours, drawing in through cracks and keyholes the cool dampness of the gardens beyond. If you stand quite still, you may hear, very faintly, the soft tick of a long-case clock in some adjoining room, that gentle wooden heartbeat that has measured out the hours of this palace since long before any of us were born. The clock you hear, were you to seek it out, is one of dozens scattered throughout the building, each one wound by hand each morning by a particular gentleman whose entire profession was, and in some sense remains, the keeping of the palace's time. The clockmasters of Versailles climbed small wooden ladders to reach the high faces of their charges, opened the polished brass-doored cabinets, and adjusted the slow, swinging pendulums with a delicate brass key that they carried always upon a faded silk ribbon around their necks. The synchronization of all the palace clocks was a daily ritual of profound patience, a small, quiet conspiracy of devotion to order in a world that, then as now, was always tilting toward chaos. Stand here a moment longer, let the cool of the marble rise softly through your feet, settling you, grounding you, soothing you. The vestibule is only the threshold, the gentlest hint of what lies beyond. Already the day you carried in with you has begun to recede, dissolving slowly into the patient hush of these old stones, leaving you lighter, softer, ready to drift onward into the deeper rooms of the night. Before we step into the brighter, more famous chambers, let us linger for a while in a place few visitors ever see. Along the eastern wall of the vestibule, just past the second pilaster, hangs a tapestry of considerable size, woven in the workshops of the Gobelins manufactory in the late 17th century, depicting a peaceful scene of Diana the huntress resting beneath a willow tree. To the casual eye it is merely an ornament, one of many such hangings that soften the cool stone of the palace walls. But to those who knew the building intimately, to the chamber valets and the maîtres d'hôtel and the discreet messengers who moved through these halls like shadows in soft slippers, this particular tapestry concealed a secret. Lift the lower edge of it now, gently with the tips of your fingers. The wool is heavy, denser than one would expect, woven so tightly that a candle held behind it casts only the faintest blush of amber upon the front. The dyes are still rich, even after centuries of dust and gentle care. The deep madder reds and the indigo blues and the soft sage greens having mellowed only slightly into a more harmonious palette, as though time itself were a painter who had learned eventually the value of restraint. Behind the tapestry, set flush into the panelling, is a small door, no taller than the shoulders of an average woman, finished in the same pale cream paint as the surrounding wall, with a tiny brass knob that has been polished by 1,000 cautious fingers into a smooth, unblemished gleam. Press the knob very gently, and the door swings inward upon hinges that have been oiled with such patient regularity that they make no sound at all, not even the faintest whisper of complaint. We must duck slightly to pass through, and as we do so, the close, intimate scent of the hidden stairwell rises softly to meet us. It is a scent quite different from the formal corridors we have left behind. There is the dry, papery smell of old plaster, the faint mineral tang of the stone steps, the lingering warmth of beeswax candles that have burned in this narrow space for centuries, and beneath it all, almost imperceptible, a thread of something herbal and sweet. Perhaps the dried lavender that the chambermaids once tucked into corners to keep the air pleasant during their long climbs. The stairway itself is narrow, scarcely wide enough for 2 people to pass without one of them turning sideways, and the steps are made of a dark oak that has been worn into a soft central groove by the passage of countless footsteps. Run your hand along the wall as we begin our slow ascent. You will feel beneath your palm not the smooth plaster of the public rooms, but a rougher, more honest surface, finished with a simple coat of whitewash that has flaked here and there to reveal the pale stone beneath. There is no grand decoration here, no gilded moulding, no painted cherub watching from above. This was never a stairway meant to impress. It was a stairway meant to function, to allow servants to move between floors without disrupting the carefully choreographed rituals of the rooms they served. The treads creak very faintly beneath our weight, but it is a soft creak, a contented creak, the sound of seasoned wood that has settled comfortably into its long task. Each step is slightly different from the next, some a hair higher, some a hair lower, the small irregularities that betray the work of human hands rather than the cold precision of a modern mill. The carpenters who fitted these steps did so by candlelight, kneeling upon the unfinished framework, planing each tread with long, slow strokes of a hand plane that hissed softly through the oak and left curling ribbons of pale shaving upon the floor. As we climb, the stairway turns once, twice in a tight spiral, and at each turning there is a small landing where a single iron candle holder is fixed to the wall. The holders are simple, almost crude in comparison to the gilded sconces of the public rooms, but their simplicity has its own quiet beauty. Each one was forged in the palace's own ironworks by a smith who understood that not every piece of metal needs to declare itself loudly, that some things are made to serve quietly and last long. The candles within them are short stubs of yellow tallow, the kind used by the lower household, cheaper than the tall white wax candles of the royal chambers, but burning with their own warm golden glow and emitting a soft, slightly animal scent that hangs sweetly in the close air of the stairwell. Imagine for a moment a young chambermaid of the 18th century making her way up these very steps in the pre-dawn hours. She is perhaps 16 years old, her hair tucked beneath a plain white linen cap, her apron wrapped tightly over a grey woolen dress. In one hand she carries a brass jug of warm water, the steam rising softly in faint curls. In the other, a small wicker basket containing freshly ironed linens, scented faintly with dried iris root. Her slippered feet make almost no sound upon the worn oak treads, for she has been trained from her first week of service to move as silently as a passing thought. The candle she carries in a little tin holder casts a small, trembling ring of light around her, and her shadow stretches long and wavering up the wall ahead. She does not pause, she does not look around. Her mind is already in the chamber she is bound for, already going over the small tasks that must be completed before the lady of that chamber awakens. The tapestries are to be lightly brushed, the fireplace must be relit gently, so that the room warms slowly rather than all at once. The chamber pot must be removed and replaced, the water must be poured into the porcelain basin upon the dressing table, the fresh linen must be laid upon the back of the chair. All of this must happen before the first faint stirring from the curtained bed, and all of it must happen in absolute silence. Continue with me now, slowly up the final flight. The stairway opens at the top onto another small door. This one, even smaller than the first, set into a corner of an upper landing. We step through it and find ourselves in a long, narrow corridor that runs the length of the palace, parallel to the grand public rooms, but entirely hidden from them. This is the servants' passage, one of many, a secret artery through which the daily life of the palace once pulsed without ever being seen by those it served. The corridor in which we now find ourselves stretches onward into a soft amber dimness, its ceiling low enough that a tall man would need to stoop slightly beneath the crossbeams that span its length at regular intervals. These beams are of dark oak, hand-hewn from trees that grew somewhere in the great forests to the north, their surfaces marked by the faint diagonal grooves of an adze, that ancient tool which carpenters once swung between their feet with such practised rhythm that the curls of wood seemed almost to peel themselves away. Run your eye along one of those beams and you will see here and there the small darker knots where a branch once joined the trunk, each knot a small dark eye looking down upon the centuries of footsteps that have passed below. The walls of this corridor are simply finished, plastered smooth and washed in a soft, chalky white that has yellowed slightly with age into the colour of fresh cream. There are no paintings here, no mirrors, no gilded sconces. Instead, at intervals of perhaps every 15 paces, small iron hooks are driven into the wall, and from these hooks hang the workaday objects of household labour: a coil of stout linen rope, a folded apron of grey cotton, freshly laundered and waiting for its wearer, small wooden brush with bristles of stiff boar hair used for sweeping ash from the hearths, a leather pouch containing the silvered keys to a particular suite of rooms. Each object has its place, and each place has been considered carefully, for the servants who moved through this corridor had no time to search and no patience for clutter. Beneath our feet, the floor is laid in narrow planks of pine, the cheaper, softer wood reserved for the parts of the palace the public would never see. The planks have aged into a warm, mellow honey brown, polished by the constant passage of slippered feet rather than by any scrubbing or waxing. Notice as we walk how the floor dips very slightly along its centre, worn down by the patient repetition of 3 centuries of footsteps. It is the gentlest of valleys, scarcely visible to the eye, but a finger drawn along it would feel the subtle hollow, the faint bowing toward the middle that betrays the cumulative weight of human labour. Along the right-hand wall, every dozen paces or so, small wooden doors stand at intervals, each one marked with a tiny brass plate engraved with a number. These doors lead to the cabinets, the small antechambers, the wardrobes and closets that connect to the grand rooms beyond. Servant moving along this corridor would pause at the appropriate door, lift the latch with the practised quietness of long habit, and slip through into the public side of the palace as smoothly as a breath passing between lips. By this hidden network, the entire vast machinery of the household was kept invisible, allowing the courtiers in their gilded salons to imagine, if they wished, that meals appeared from nowhere, and chamber pots emptied themselves and fires lit themselves at the precise moment they were needed. The scents that linger in this corridor are humble, domestic, and deeply soothing. There is the warm, soft smell of clean cotton sheets that have been ironed earlier in the day and stacked in their wicker baskets for distribution at dawn. There is the faintly sweet aroma of the beeswax that has been melted and stirred into the polished jars, ready to be applied with cotton rags to the great oak doors and the parquet floors of the public chambers. There is, drifting from a distant doorway, the comforting fragrance of bread baking in a great brick oven, that yeasty golden scent which seems to belong to all kitchens of all centuries, a scent that bypasses the conscious mind entirely and goes straight to the older animal part of us that knows, simply, that warmth and food and shelter are near. Pause now beside one of the small wooden doors. Bring your ear, gently, almost not at all, to the painted wood. Listen. Beyond it you may hear the faint murmur of one of the great salons, perhaps the soft chiming of a clock, the distant ticking of porcelain figurines whose small mechanical hearts wind down and stop only to be patiently rewound the following morning. That tiny tick is the only voice of the great empty room beyond, and it whispers steadily, untroubled, indifferent to whether anyone is listening at all. The corridor curves now very gently around a corner, and at the curve there is a small alcove set back into the wall. Within the alcove stands a simple wooden bench, the kind a tired chambermaid might sink onto for a moment between her tasks, easing the ache from her feet, drawing a slow breath before continuing on. The wood of the bench is worn smooth in two distinct hollows where countless servants have sat side by side, their hips and thighs polishing the timber over generations into shapes more comfortable than any cabinet maker could have planned. Above the bench, a small window is cut into the outer wall, no larger than a folded handkerchief, glazed with a single pane of thick, slightly distorted glass. Through this little window, if we approach and look outward, we see a slice of the palace gardens by night, the tops of the clipped hedges making their dark, geometric shapes against the moonlit sky. The view is narrow, only a few square feet of the outside world made visible from this hidden inner corridor. But for the servants who climbed and descended these passages 100 times a day, that slim glimpse of moonlight or rainfall or autumn leaves was a small treasure. Imagine a young footman pausing here at the end of a long evening, leaning his forehead briefly against the cool glass, allowing himself just a moment to breathe before the bell summoned him onward again. Imagine the soft fog of his breath blooming and fading on the pane, a tiny transient signature of his presence here, gone before anyone could ever notice. Continue along the corridor with me. We pass another door, and another, each one bearing its small brass number, each one leading to its own particular antechamber or wardrobe or hidden stair. Above one of the doors we notice a small bell mounted on a coiled spring, connected by a slender wire that runs along the wall and disappears into a small hole in the plaster. This is one of the great innovations of the palace's later centuries, a system of bell pulls by which a courtier in a distant chamber could summon a servant simply by tugging on a tasseled cord. The bell would jangle softly, and the servant assigned to that particular wire would know, instantly and silently, which room required attention. There were dozens upon dozens of such bells throughout the palace, an entire orchestra of summons, each with its own faintly distinct tone, and the senior servants could distinguish them by ear alone, much as a mother can distinguish the cry of her own child from the cry of any other. To stand in this corridor in the busiest hours of the day, in the centuries when the palace overflowed with its courtly population, would have been to hear a faint and constant tinkling like distant wind chimes, like the shifting of small leaves in a gentle breeze. But tonight, of course, the bells are silent. They hang upon their springs in patient stillness, their wires slack, their tongues motionless. The corridor breathes its slow, ancient breath. The candles in their iron holders flicker softly in the faint, unseen draughts that move through the building, and our shadows, long and wavering, glide quietly along the cream-coloured walls beside us. There is something profoundly restful in walking through a place built for purposes that have long since fallen silent. The corridor has not been forgotten exactly, but it has been allowed to rest, and in resting it has become a kind of slow meditation, a long thought made of plaster and oak and patient air. Take one more breath here, and let your shoulders soften further still. There is more to see, much more, and the night is far from over. But there is also no hurry, none whatsoever, and the corridor will wait as long as we need. We emerge now from the hidden corridor through a small, unobtrusive door tucked discreetly into the panelling, and as we step across its threshold, the very air around us changes. The close, warm intimacy of the servants' passage falls away, replaced by an extraordinary expansion, as though the building itself has drawn a long, deep breath and held it there in the form of an immense silvered hall. We have entered, dear listener, the most famous chamber in all the palace, the long gallery known to every traveller and every history book as the Hall of Mirrors. And at this hour, in this hush, it does not look at all the way you might expect. By daylight, this is a room of dazzling brilliance, almost overwhelming in its splendour. The 17 tall arched windows along its western wall flood the chamber with the golden light of the western gardens, and that light is caught and multiplied and thrown back by the 17 corresponding mirrored arches set into the eastern wall, each made of dozens of smaller mirrored panes fitted together with the patient precision of a master jeweller. By day the hall blazes. By day the hall sings. But by night, in the soft, silvered quiet of the moon, the hall does something far more mysterious. It dreams. Pause with me at the entrance. Let your eyes adjust slowly to the long, low luminescence of the space. The polished parquet floor stretches ahead of us in a vast herringbone pattern, each small piece of pale oak set carefully against its neighbour at a 45-degree angle, the whole floor gleaming faintly with the soft moonlight that falls through the western windows in long diagonal columns. Where the moonlight strikes the floor, it pools in pale, silvery rectangles, and within those rectangles the herringbone pattern is just visible, a faint geometric whisper beneath the wash of light. Where the moonlight does not reach, the parquet falls into soft, warm shadow, and the small irregularities of the wood, the subtle variations in tone from board to board, become invisible, leaving only the long, dark expanse stretching onward into the gloom. The ceiling above us is one of the great painted glories of the 17th century, an enormous canvas of allegorical scenes celebrating the reign of the Sun King in colours of warm rose and dusty gold and the deep wine-dark blue of an evening sky. By day, every figure is visible, every cloud and every laurel wreath, every cherub with its rounded cheeks and its softly curling hair. By night, only the brightest highlights catch the lantern's distant glow, and the rest of the ceiling becomes a great, dim, painted heaven, suggesting movement and presence without committing to any particular detail. You may stand beneath it for a long while and find new shapes emerging slowly from the dimness, a rounded shoulder here, a half-glimpsed wing there, the curve of a draped garment, the soft gesture of a painted hand. But it is the mirrors, of course, that draw the eye most powerfully, and that ask of us the longest looking. Step closer, slowly, to one of the great mirrored arches along the eastern wall. The mirror is not, as a modern mirror would be, a single seamless sheet of perfect glass. It is composed instead of 21 smaller pieces, each one fitted into a delicate gilded framework, and where the panes meet there are fine, almost invisible seams. To gaze into such a mirror is to see oneself, and the room behind one, very nearly perfectly reflected, but with the faintest of breaks, as though the image had been gently fractured and then patiently reassembled by a careful hand. The glass itself, made in the 17th century by the famous mirror makers whose secret techniques were once smuggled at great risk from Venice to France, has aged in a way that no modern mirror ever could. Its silvering, applied in those days with sheets of tin foil and shimmering pools of mercury, has acquired over the centuries a faint, ghostly mottling, small dark constellations within the silver, where the chemistry of the backing has slowly transformed itself. To look into one of these mirrors is therefore to see oneself reflected, yes, but reflected through a soft, dreamlike mist, as though through the surface of a shallow forest pool at dusk. The reflection is true, but it is not quite this moment. It is also a little of every moment that the mirror has ever held. Imagine, for a slow heartbeat, all that this glass has reflected over the course of its long existence. The candlelit gowns of the 17th century court, with their stiff pleated bodices and their cascading lace cuffs, the powdered wigs of the 18th century, towering and sculptural, dusted faintly with the fine white powder that drifted in soft halos around their wearers, the plumed hats of military officers and the flowing dressing gowns of late-rising princes, the hurried passage of footmen carrying silver trays, the slow contemplative pacing of a queen alone with her thoughts in the early morning. All of it has passed before these silvered surfaces, and although none of those images remain visible to us, there is a curious sense standing here that they are not quite gone either, that they have become a part of the soft mottling within the silver, a part of the gentle, dreamlike imperfection that distinguishes these mirrors from all others. Turn now slowly to face the western wall, the wall of the great arched windows. The windows here are tall, perhaps 30 feet from sill to crown, divided into many small panes by slender lead muntins. The glass in each pane is hand-blown, and you can see, if you look closely, the gentle ripples and soft distortions that betray the work of the glass-blower's lung and lip. Through these slightly imperfect panes, the moonlight falls into the room in a way that no perfect modern glass would allow. It scatters, it softens, it breaks into faint, almost imperceptible little auras around its brighter beams. The result is a quality of light that the modern eye is unaccustomed to, a light that feels older, gentler, more patient than any electric illumination ever could. Beyond the windows, far below, the great gardens of Versailles spread outward in their geometric vastness. The parterres and the long allées of clipped trees and the silvered ribbons of the canals, all of them dim and indistinct in the moonlight, suggested rather than seen. Pale fog has begun to gather along the lowest terraces, drifting slowly over the gravel paths, blurring the outlines of distant statues into ghostly silhouettes. From this height, the palace gardens look not like gardens at all, but like some vast, slumbering tapestry laid out beneath a soft grey-blue sky, its details softened, its patterns simplified into long calligraphic strokes of dark and pale. The great chandeliers that hang along the length of the hall, each one suspended by a long iron chain from the painted ceiling, are unlit at this hour. Their crystal pendants, however, do not need to be lit to perform their quiet magic. The faint moonlight that fills the room is enough to ignite within each pendant a small, cool gleam, and as the chandeliers move ever so slightly upon their chains, in response to draughts we cannot quite feel, those small gleams shift and dance like hesitant fireflies suspended high above us. There must be tens of thousands of crystals in this hall altogether, and each one is doing the same patient work tonight that it has done for centuries, catching what little light there is, holding it briefly, letting it go. Let us walk slowly down the centre of the hall, our footsteps soft upon the parquet. The length of the room is greater than the eye easily measures, and we will reach the far end only by walking unhurriedly, allowing each pace to settle before the next. To our right, the windows. To our left, the mirrors between them. Suspended in this long ribbon of silvered light, our own reflections accompany us, slightly fragmented, slightly dreamlike, walking in step with us along the eastern wall, as though we had brought a quieter, calmer version of ourselves along for the journey. There is a special hush in this hall at this hour, a hush that one can feel against the skin like the lightest possible silk. The day's tourists have long since departed. The guards have completed their rounds and retreated to their warm posts elsewhere. The hall belongs, for these few slow hours, only to the moonlight, to the patient mirrors, to the gentle imperfection of old glass, and to whatever drowsy traveller has been fortunate enough to slip in unnoticed and wander softly through its long and luminous quiet. Let us drift now from the silvered hush of the great gallery into a chamber far smaller, far more intimate, yet in many ways the most consequential room in the entire palace. We pass through a tall double door of richly carved walnut, and the door yields with the softest of clicks as though it has been waiting patiently to admit us. Beyond it lies the king's bedchamber, the very heart of the palace, the room around which the entire vast machinery of the French court once turned like the slow, silent revolutions of a planet around its sun. The chamber is not a vast room. By the standards of the gilded salons we have already passed through, it is in fact rather modest, perhaps 30 feet by 25, with a ceiling that, while painted and ornamented, does not soar to the heights of the more public chambers. But what this room lacks in size, it gains in concentrated splendor. Every surface has been considered. Every surface has been adorned. Every surface has been polished to the point where it seems to shimmer faintly with its own inner light. The walls are hung with crimson damask woven in Lyon by silk makers whose families had practiced their craft for generations. The pattern a complex repetition of pomegranates and acanthus leaves embroidered in threads of pale gold. Where the silk has aged, in the corners shielded from sunlight, the colour remains a deep, full carmine. Where the morning sun has touched it for 3 centuries, it has faded into a softer, almost rose-coloured warmth, and the contrast between the two tones, when one stands in the centre of the room, gives the walls a curious breathing quality, as though the chamber itself were exhaling slowly toward you. In the centre of the room, raised slightly upon a low platform and separated from the rest of the chamber by a delicate gilded balustrade, stands the great state bed. It is an enormous structure, more architecture than furniture, a small canopied palace within the palace itself. Its 4 corner posts rise nearly to the ceiling. each one carved with intricate patterns of laurel leaves and royal sun emblems and small peeping cherubs. From these posts is suspended a tester, a sort of square wooden frame draped on every side with curtains of the same crimson silk that lines the walls, embroidered along their lower hems with broad bands of gold and silver thread that catch even the faintest light and turn it into something glittering. The curtains are tied back during the daytime hours with thick silken cords ending in heavy tassels, and at night they would have been drawn close to enclose the king in his own private cocoon of warmth and shadow. Within the bed itself, beneath the canopy, lay a thick mattress stuffed with the down of geese and the soft inner feathers of swans, layered upon a base of horsehair, layered upon a base of straw, layered upon the wooden bedstead beneath. Upon this mattress lay sheets of the finest linen woven in Holland and brought across the Channel in carefully sealed wooden chests. Upon those sheets soft pillows stuffed with the same precious down. Upon those pillows the slowly waking head of a king. It is the slow waking of that head we have come to consider tonight. For the morning rising of the King of France was no ordinary thing. It was a ceremony, it was a ritual. It was a piece of theatre performed before a carefully selected audience. Every gesture choreographed by long tradition, every minute accounted for, every small action laden with significance. The French called it the lever du roi, the rising of the king, and it began long before the king himself opened his eyes. The first stirring of the day in this chamber came not from the king at all, but from the most senior of his personal valets, a man called the premier valet de chambre, whose great honour and lifelong responsibility it was to sleep upon a small folding cot at the foot of the king's bed, separated from his master only by a few feet of polished parquet. He would rise in the soft grey hour before dawn, fold his cot away with practised silence, and prepare the chamber for the gradual entrance of those who would, over the next 2 hours, attend the king's awakening. The fire in the great marble hearth, having burned low through the night, was carefully tended. Fresh logs added gently so as not to crack and spit. The bellows worked slowly to coax the flames into a warm, steady glow. The heavy curtains at the windows were drawn open just slightly, allowing the first thin grey light of morning to filter into the room, but never so much that it might startle the sleeper. At the appointed hour, the first of the day's many small admissions began. This was called the première entrée, the first entry, and only a select few were permitted to take part. The royal physician, who would assess the king's health with a quiet glance and a gentle hand upon the wrist. The royal surgeon, the first chaplain, a handful of the most senior officers of the royal household. They moved softly in slippered feet, their voices reduced to the merest whispers, and they took up their positions at the various stations around the bed with the precision of well-rehearsed dancers. The king himself, during these first soft minutes, would still be allowed the courtesy of waking gradually, drifting up from sleep in the way any of us might, his breath slowing its deep rhythm, his eyelids fluttering once, twice before opening into the dim red-gold warmth of the canopy above him. He would lie still for a moment, gathering himself. He would say nothing. The room around him would respect this nothing, this small quiet pause at the edge of the day, and would breathe in time with him. Then softly the rituals would begin. A bowl of warm water, scented faintly with rose and orange flower, was brought forth on a silver tray. The king's hands were bathed gently, dried with a folded linen cloth, perfumed with a few drops of an oil specially blended for him in the royal apothecary. His face was wiped with a damp cloth, steeped in spirit of wine, then dried with another, then patted softly with a third. His hair was combed by a senior valet whose only daily task this was, the combs of polished tortoise shells drawing slowly through the long royal locks, smoothing each strand into place with the patience of a sculptor smoothing wet clay. As these small ministrations proceeded, the second wave of admissions began, the seconde entrée, by which a slightly larger circle of high officials was permitted to enter the chamber and witness the unfolding ceremony. Then a third entry, then a fourth. With each new admission, a few more carefully chosen souls were allowed to step softly into the room, until at last, by the time the king was being dressed in his shirt, his stockings, his breeches, and his coat, the chamber would be quietly filled with perhaps 100 persons of the highest rank. each of them standing in absolute attentive silence, watching the slow sacred dressing of the body of their sovereign. Imagine this scene for a slow, drifting moment, the hush of the room, the soft, almost devotional quality of every gesture, the faint scent of orange flower water rising from the warm bowls, the whisper of fine linen being lifted carefully from a folded stack, the small, polite cough, instantly suppressed, of a courtier who had stood too long without breakfast, the first pale shaft of full daylight finding its way at last between the heavy curtains, falling across the gilded balustrade, slipping along the carved bedpost, brushing softly against the embroidered hem of a damask drape. All of this was Versailles in its purest form, a carefully designed liturgy in which the rising of one human being became, by the patient artifice of a court, the rising of an entire kingdom into another day. Having risen from the great state bed, the king is led, in our gentle imagining, to a small antechamber adjoining the bedchamber, a room less famous than its neighbour, but in many ways more revealing of the texture of daily life within these walls. This is the cabinet de toilette, the dressing closet where the long, careful, almost devotional ritual of preparing the royal body for public view would unfold each morning across the better part of an hour. Let us drift quietly into it now, careful not to disturb the patient choreography that once filled this space, careful to keep our footsteps soft upon the inlaid floor. The room itself is panelled in pale oak, painted a soft silvery green, the colour of young willow leaves in early spring, with thin lines of gilded moulding tracing the edges of each panel in fine, almost calligraphic strokes. The light here is gentler than in the bedchamber, for the windows are smaller and set higher, allowing the morning sun to enter only as a soft, indirect glow that pools on the upper portions of the walls and dissolves slowly toward the floor. In the centre of the room, beneath the largest of these high windows, stands a long table covered with a heavy cloth of white linen, and upon this cloth are arranged, in patient and unchanging order, the many small instruments of the royal toilette. Let us walk slowly along this table together and consider each object in turn, for each of them tells its own quiet story of craftsmanship and devotion. At the leftmost end of the cloth stands a tall ewer of beaten silver, its surface chased with delicate patterns of vines and flowers, its handle curved into the shape of a slender swan's neck. Within it is held warm water that has been heated in the great kitchens far below, carried up through the back stairs, decanted with care, and kept just slightly steaming by a small flame within a copper warmer set discreetly beneath the table. Beside the ewer rests a matching basin, broad and shallow, also of silver, lined with a thin cloth of fine linen, so that the king's hands might be washed without ever quite touching the cool metal beneath. Little further along, set in a precise row, are several small porcelain pots of varying sizes, each one fitted with a tiny silver lid. These contain the various preparations used upon the royal face. There is a pale cream made from almond oil and sweet beeswax for softening the skin. There is a pale powder of finely ground rice flour for matting any unwelcome shine. There is a small dish of carmine paste, a soft rose-coloured pigment used very sparingly to lend the cheeks a hint of colour during the longer winter months, when little sunlight could be expected. There is a pomade of softened lard scented with rose and clove for smoothing the eyebrows into their preferred arch. Each of these little jars is tended with great seriousness by the gentleman of the wardrobe, who replaces each preparation at the appropriate intervals, who notes their gradual depletion in a small leather-bound book kept for the purpose, and who never, under any circumstances, permits a single jar to stand uncovered for longer than the moments of its actual use. Beyond these pots, set on small silver stands, are arranged a number of brushes, each made for a particular purpose. A broad, soft brush of pale badger hair for dusting away fine traces of powder, a narrower brush of squirrel hair, finer still for the eyebrows, small flat brush of stiffer boar bristle for the polishing of the teeth, which would be done with a paste of crushed coral and powdered cuttlebone scented with mint and clove, a long slim brush of the softest sable for the application of a pale colourless balm to the lips. The handles of these brushes are of polished tortoiseshell or carved ivory, and each handle bears, upon its narrowest point, the small engraved sun emblem of the king himself, an ornament so subtle that only the closest observer would ever notice it. To the right of the brushes stands the great box of combs, a flat case of polished walnut hinged with thin brass strips, opened reverently each morning by the senior valet whose responsibility was the care of the royal hair. Within the case, lying upon a bed of dark blue velvet, rest perhaps a dozen combs of varying sizes and materials. Some are of polished horn, dark amber in colour, their teeth so finely cut that one might count 30 teeth within the span of a single inch. Others are of carved boxwood, paler and warmer to the touch, and used for the gentler combing of damp hair after washing. Still others are of mother of pearl, iridescent and cool, reserved for the final smoothing of the locks before the wig of the day was set carefully into place. But the wigs themselves deserve a moment of our attention, for they were the great visible glory of the royal toilette in this period, and the room in which they were stored, just beyond a small door at the far end of the dressing closet, was its own quiet wonder. Within that little chamber, on stands of carved wood made in the rough shape of a human head, perhaps 60 wigs of varying lengths and styles awaited their daily turn. The wig-master would select one each morning according to the activities planned for the day: a long, dramatic, full-bottomed wig for high ceremonial occasions, a simpler tied-back wig for hunting in the parks, a softer, more relaxed wig for the quieter hours of late afternoon. Each wig was made of human hair, carefully gathered and sorted by a guild of specialized craftsmen, washed in solutions of soap and herbs, conditioned with oils, curled around heated rods, and set into its final shape upon the wooden head form, where it would rest until its appointed day. When the chosen wig had been brought forward and laid carefully upon a velvet cushion before the king, the powdering of it would commence. This was a delicate operation, performed in a small adjoining cabinet so that the fine drift of powder would not settle upon the gilded furnishings of the dressing-room itself. The wig was placed upon a stand. A linen cloth was draped over the king's shoulders, covering him entirely. A bellows-shaped device of leather and brass was filled with a fine white powder made from finely milled wheat starch, scented with orris root and a faint trace of bergamot. The valet would then squeeze the bellows gently, and a soft cloud of pale powder would drift over the wig, settling slowly into its curls and waves, and the air itself would become briefly luminous with the suspension of these tiny white particles, like the slow falling of snowflakes within a closed glass globe. Once the powdering was complete, the wig would be lifted with infinite care and settled upon the king's head, where it would be adjusted with small patient touches until it sat exactly as the wig-master desired, every curl in its proper place, every small twist of hair behaving precisely as fashion required. Then the dressing of the body would proceed, layer upon careful layer. Each garment passed from the appropriate officer of the wardrobe to the appropriate valet. Each garment received with a slight bow, each garment lowered onto the royal frame with hands that were neither too quick nor too hesitant. The shirt of fine cambric, embroidered at the cuffs with a tracery of pale silk, the waistcoat of brocade stiff with embroidery and threads of gold and silver, the breeches of soft kid leather or fine wool, fastened at the knee with small jewelled buckles, the stockings of pale silk drawn carefully over the calves and held in place by ribboned garters, the shoes of polished black leather, with their high red heels that were the privilege of the royal house alone, their broad silver buckles set with small glinting paste stones, the coat itself, the long justaucorps of richly embroidered velvet dropping to the knees, its skirts stiffened slightly with a layer of horsehair so that they fell in sculptural folds when the king stood at full height, and finally the small accessories, the lace cravat tied with practised ease, the slim sword in its enamelled scabbard, the lace handkerchief tucked into a sleeve, the rings slid onto particular fingers in their accustomed order. By the time all this was complete, the king stood transformed, no longer simply a man freshly risen from sleep, but a sovereign prepared for the day's many ceremonies. Every visible inch of him polished, perfumed, embroidered, and arranged. The whole long ritual had taken perhaps an hour and a quarter. The whole long ritual had been performed almost in silence, and now, with the smallest of nods, the king would step from the dressing-closet into the larger world of his palace, and the patient arts of the toilette would be tucked back into their pots and cases until the following dawn. Let us drift downward now, slowly and softly, far below the gilded ceilings and the silken canopies, into a world that few visitors to this palace ever see, a world that lies beneath the polished parquet of the great salons like the patient roots beneath a flowering tree. We descend a narrow stone staircase whose steps have been worn into gentle hollows by the passage of countless servants, and as we go the air around us changes once again. The cool, perfumed hush of the upper rooms gives way to a warmer, more substantial air, an air weighted with wood smoke and the slow, savoury fragrance of long-simmering stocks, with the bright sharpness of citrus peel and the deep, earthy sweetness of caramelizing onions and the soft, yeasty breath of rising bread. We have arrived in the kitchens of Versailles, the vast and patient engine room of the entire palace, the place where the day's many meals were conjured and choreographed and dispatched on their long journeys upward through the building. The kitchens, though hidden from polite view, were themselves a small kingdom. They occupied a long row of vaulted rooms beneath the palace and along its outer wings, and they were staffed at the height of the court's flourishing by perhaps 300 souls, each with his or her own small place within the larger pattern. There were the officiers de bouche, the senior officers of the mouth who held titles of considerable dignity and who oversaw the preparation of every dish destined for the royal table. There were the rôtisseurs, whose entire profession was the slow turning of meats upon great iron spits. There were the pâtissiers, who worked in their own separate room scented with butter and almond and warm honey. There were the saucers, who tended the bubbling cauldrons of stocks and reductions with the patience of alchemists. There were the herbalists who moved among hanging bundles of dried thyme and rosemary and bay, choosing each leaf with the care of a jeweller selecting a stone. The chamber in which we now stand is the largest of the kitchens, and the moment one steps into it, one understands at once that this is a working space designed for an extraordinary scale of labour. The ceiling vaults overhead in great low arches of pale stone, blackened here and there above the cooking ranges by the patient soot of generations. The floor is laid with broad slabs of grey limestone, worn into a soft polish by the constant movement of feet and the patient slosh of water from the scullery beyond. Along one entire wall stretches the great cooking range, a long brick and iron structure perhaps 30 feet in length, its surface punctuated by a dozen separate fire pits and cooking holes, each with its own iron grate and its own carefully tended bed of glowing charcoal. Above each fire pit, set into the ceiling, is a wide copper hood that draws the smoke and the heated air upward into a system of brick flues that vent eventually into the chimneys high above. Look closely at one of those fire pits. The charcoal within it has been burned down from the bright orange of new flame into the soft, deep red of patient embers, and across the iron grate above it sits a heavy copper pan, its surface darkened with use, but its inner lining still gleaming faintly with the reflective sheen of pure tin. Within the pan, slowly and without hurry, a sauce is reducing. It has been simmering for several hours already, perhaps longer, and its surface is just barely trembling. The merest suggestion of motion, the faintest ripples spreading outward from time to time as a single bubble rises and breaks. The colour of the sauce is the deep, glossy brown of a mature autumn forest after rain, and its scent, when one leans gently above the pan, is of red wine reduced to its essence, of veal bones long roasted, of shallots cooked until they have surrendered all their sharpness into a sweet dark gold. Beside this pan, upon a great wooden chopping block scarred by decades of careful use, lies a small mound of finely chopped herbs, the work of perhaps an hour of patient attention by an apprentice cook. The pile is mostly flat-leaved parsley, brilliant green, but flecked through with the silvery grey of fresh sage and the thin dark needles of rosemary cut so finely that they resemble the strokes of a calligrapher's pen. The smell that rises from this little mound is sharp and clean, almost peppery, and it cuts through the deeper smells of the kitchen like a high, bright note in an otherwise low and patient melody. Across the room, in its own dedicated alcove, stands the great rotisserie wall, a tall vertical hearth before which several long iron spits are mounted at varying heights. Along these spits, on this imagined evening, are skewered several large pieces of meat, A haunch of venison glazed slowly with butter and red wine, a row of plump chickens larded with strips of pork fat, a saddle of mutton studded with cloves of garlic, and tied with strands of butcher's twine. The spits turn very slowly, perhaps once every 2 minutes, and the turning is accomplished not by any human hand but by an extraordinary device known as the smoke jack, a small bladed wheel set within the chimney itself, which is spun by the rising current of hot air, and which is connected, a long chain of slender cogs and gears running down through the flue to the spits below. The whole apparatus turns with a soft, regular ticking sound, almost like the patient beat of a slow clock, and the meats turn with it, basting themselves in their own slow-rendered juices. The dripping fat caught in long copper trays beneath them where it could be spooned back over the surface of the meat at intervals by a vigilant rôtisseur. The light in the kitchen is golden, warm and gentle, cast partly by the open fires and partly by oil lamps mounted in iron brackets along the wall. The lamps burn a refined animal oil that gives a soft, steady flame and only the faintest of acrid scents, and their light falls upon the long tables of scrubbed pine where the work of the kitchen is laid out in patient stations. At one such table, a cook is rolling out a sheet of fine pastry dough with a long marble pin, working from the centre outward in slow, even streams. The dough is pale and faintly translucent at its thinning edges, and a fine dusting of white flour rises in small clouds with every pass of the pin, settling slowly upon his bare forearms and upon the front of his linen apron. At another table, a young apprentice is shelling peas, the small green orbs falling one by one into a copper bowl with a soft, regular tinkling sound, while the empty pods are dropped into a separate basket from which they will later be added to the stock pot. Beyond these working tables, set against the far wall, stands the great dish dresser, a tall wooden structure of many shelves upon which the polished copperware of the kitchen is arranged in long gleaming ranks. There are pans of every conceivable size, from the smallest single-egg saucepan no larger than a teacup to the great cauldrons that would require 2 strong men to lift. There are moulds in the shapes of fish and rabbits and small architectural follies used for the elaborate jellies and aspics that delighted the royal table. There are long copper fish kettles with their fitted strainer plates. There are turbot-shaped pans of beaten copper, made to hold the famously awkward flat fish at its proper attitude during cooking. Each of these vessels has been polished daily, scoured with fine sand and lemon juice and a particular paste made from wood ash and oil, until the copper glows with a soft, rosy warmth that catches and holds the light of the lamps. At the appointed hour, the great procession upward would begin. The dishes, having been finished and arranged upon their silver platters and covered with their domed silver cloches, would be carried out of the kitchen by a long line of footmen, each one trained to hold his platter at exactly the proper height, exactly the proper distance from his body, with neither tremor nor hurry. The line of footmen would proceed up a series of dedicated staircases, through certain corridors reserved for their passage, past doors held open at precise moments by other footmen stationed for that exact purpose. The journey from kitchen to royal table could take, in the larger reaches of the palace, more than 15 minutes. To compensate, the dishes were placed beneath their domed cloches upon small braziers of glowing charcoal set within wheeled wooden carriages, the whole apparatus gliding silently along the polished floors, the food kept warm by the slow, patient breath of the embers below. By the time the platters were placed upon the table before the king, the meal was as fresh and as fragrant as it had been in the kitchen far below. The patient choreography of the palace had performed, once again, its small and beautiful daily miracle. Let us rise once more slowly from the warm and fragrant kitchens, drifting upward through the patient passageways through which the procession of footmen has already begun its careful ascent. We follow them now gently at a slight distance, as they carry their domed silver platters upward into the higher reaches of the palace. The long corridor through which they pass is dimmer than the public chambers, but brighter than the servants' passages, lit by tall standing candelabra placed at intervals along the walls, each one bearing 8 candles of pale beeswax that burn with a clean golden steadiness. As we follow them, the scents of the kitchen drift upward with us, but softened, mellowed, no longer overwhelming, only suggested like the memory of a feast rather than the feast itself. The footmen ascend without speaking. They have learned, through long practice, to walk with such evenness of step that the silver lids upon their platters do not so much as tremble. Their eyes are fixed forward at a particular angle, neither too high nor too low, and their gloved hands grip the platter handles with that exact pressure which holds the dish absolutely steady without seeming to grip at all. They are, in a sense, dancers, performing a slow and ancient choreography that has been refined across more than a century of daily repetition, and the great machinery of the palace runs upon their patient rhythm. We arrive now at the antechamber that adjoins the king's dining hall, a room of considerable size, whose walls are panelled in pale oak and hung with paintings of game and fruit and silver tableware, a kind of visual prelude to the meal that lies beyond. Here the procession of footmen pauses briefly to consult with the senior maitre d'hotel, a tall and dignified gentleman dressed in a long coat of dark blue velvet trimmed with silver braid, who carries in his hand a long ebony staff capped with a small silver knob. This staff is his badge of office, the symbol of his absolute authority over every detail of the royal meal, and he taps it lightly upon the parquet floor in a particular rhythm that signals to the footmen the precise moment at which they may proceed forward into the dining chamber itself. We slip ahead of them now, unseen, and step through the great double doors into the room where, upon certain evenings, the most peculiar and most fascinating of all the daily rituals of the palace would unfold. This is the chamber of the grand couvert, the great public dining of the king, a ceremony that, even today, reads as somewhat astonishing to the modern ear, for at the grand couvert the King of France would dine in full view of any properly dressed visitor who wished to come and watch him eat. He sat alone, or sometimes with a small handful of his closest family members, at a richly appointed table set upon a low platform at the far end of the room, and around the edges of the chamber behind a low gilded railing. The spectators would assemble in respectful silence to observe each spoonful, each sip, each delicate gesture of his royal hands. Pause for a slow moment and consider this scene. The room is perhaps 50 feet in length and 30 in breadth, with a high coffered ceiling painted in soft blues and dusty golds, depicting in its central panel a benign goddess of plenty pouring fruits from an inexhaustible horn. The walls are hung with crimson silk damask, the same deep wine-coloured fabric that dressed the king's bedchamber, but here woven in a slightly different pattern, a repeating design of overlapping laurel wreaths bound with delicate ribbons. Tall candle sconces of gilded bronze are set at intervals along the walls, each sconce holding 6 candles. And on this particular evening every candle has been freshly lit, filling the room with that warm, slightly amber illumination that only beeswax can produce. In the centre of the platform at the far end of the room stands the king's table itself, a relatively modest piece of furniture for so grand a setting, perhaps 6 feet in length and 3 in breadth, but covered with a tablecloth of such extraordinary fineness that it seems, when one looks closely, to glow softly with its own inner whiteness. The cloth is woven from a particular linen produced only in a small region of Flanders, where the flax was grown in fields tended by generations of the same families, and where the spinning was done by women whose hands had been trained from childhood in the precise tension required. The cloth has been laundered, ironed, and folded with such patient care that the fold lines are scarcely visible, and where they are visible they form a perfect grid pattern, crisp and exact, upon the surface of the table. Upon this cloth, the place setting of the king has been arranged with the precision of a watchmaker assembling the inner workings of a fine timepiece. At the centre, exactly aligned with the chair, stands a small silver platform upon which rests a covered porcelain dish, this being the cadenas, a curious object that contained the king's personal cutlery and condiments, locked away when not in use to prevent the possibility of poisoning. Around this central piece the various plates and small dishes are arranged in a strict pattern. To the right the goblet of cut crystal upon its silver salver, awaiting the careful pour of wine that would arrive only when the king made the smallest of gestures with his hand. To the left the small porcelain dish for bread, accompanied by a tiny silver knife with a handle of mother of pearl. Beyond that, the salt cellar of beaten silver, fashioned in the shape of a small classical urn, its tiny spoon resting upon its lip. The chair itself, set just behind the table, is a substantial piece of upholstered furniture covered in the same crimson damask that lines the walls, its arms and legs gilded with thin layers of beaten gold. It is not, however, particularly comfortable, for chairs in this period were designed to encourage upright posture rather than relaxation, and the king dined, as he did most things, with his back held straight and his shoulders drawn slightly back, presenting at all times the carriage of a sovereign rather than the slouch of a private gentleman. Beyond the platform, separated from it by the low gilded railing, stretches the area in which the spectators would gather. There are no seats provided for them. They stand throughout the entirety of the meal, often for an hour or more, in their finest clothes, watching with attentive eyes as the king proceeds through the courses set before him. To enter this room as a visitor, one had only to be properly dressed in the fashion of the court and to behave with absolute decorum. A gentleman required a sword at his hip, even one borrowed for the occasion from a small store kept by the door for visitors who had arrived without one. Lady required a gown of sufficient formality and a careful arrangement of her hair. With these simple requirements satisfied, any reasonably presentable person, French or foreign courtier or curious traveller, could stand at the railing and watch the King of France eat his dinner. The procession of dishes that arrived upon this table was almost beyond the modern imagination. A single grand couvert might consist of 14 distinct courses, each course composed of multiple dishes from which the king would choose only those that pleased him. There would be soups, perhaps 3 or 4 different soups in tureens of polished silver, each one ladled into the king's bowl by a particular officer trained for that exact task. There would be entrees of roasted fowl and braised meats, of fish in delicate sauces, of vegetables prepared in ways both simple and elaborate. There would be intermediate courses of smaller, more complex preparations, little timbales and forcemeats and savoury jellies. There would be the great roasts brought forth on enormous platters by 2 or even 3 footmen working in concert. And at the end, the desserts, the patient triumphs of the pastry kitchen, fruits arranged in sculptural pyramids, small almond cakes glazed with apricot, jellies of crystalline clarity moulded into the shapes of flowers and shells, tisses of fruit pulp churned by hand in copper canisters set within wooden buckets of salted ice. Through all of this, the king ate with deliberate slowness, conversing only sparingly with whichever courtiers were honoured by his attention, and the spectators watched in patient silence, marvelling at the sheer abundance, the choreographed grace, the slow theatre of nourishment elevated into ritual. The candles burned lower in their sconces, the footmen moved like silent tides, advancing and receding, and outside the great windows the long blue evening descended quietly over the gardens, and the palace settled very gradually into the patient hush of another night. Let us turn now from the great public theatre of the king's dining and walk softly along a different corridor, one that runs parallel to the more famous chambers but leads us into a world rather different in its texture and its tone. For the Queen of France, like her husband, lived a life almost wholly composed of ritual, but the rituals that filled her days were of a softer, more domestic character, and the rooms in which they unfolded possessed a particular quietness that even now, centuries later, seems to linger in the air like the last warm note of a clavichord. The Queen's apartments occupied the southern half of the palace's central body, mirroring in a curious symmetry the king's apartments to the north. To reach them, we walk slowly along a gallery hung with paintings of distinguished female ancestors, each one gazing outward from her gilded frame with that calm, patient watchfulness which seems to belong only to the long-painted eyes of those who have already lived their lives. The carpet beneath our feet here is softer, thicker, woven in the workshops of the Savonnerie manufactory, in patterns of pale roses and entwined ribbons upon a ground of soft cream. To walk upon such a carpet is to make almost no sound at all, and the quietness it imposes upon the visitor seems part of the deliberate intention of the room itself. We pause before a tall double door of pale grey blue, its surface ornamented with delicate gilded carvings in the shape of doves and laurel branches and small clusters of myrtle berries. This door yields softly to a gentle press, and we step into the Queen's bedchamber, the heart of her own daily kingdom. The chamber is similar in size to that of the king, perhaps slightly smaller. but its character is utterly different. Where the king's room is dressed in deep crimson and heavy gold, this room is dressed in colours of softer melody. The walls are hung with silk in a pattern called gros de tours, woven in pale celadon green and embroidered in threads of silver and very pale rose. The design a repeating motif of small bouquets tied with floating ribbons. The ceiling above us is painted in delicate compositions of clouds and cherubs upon a ground of palest sky blue, the figures so softly rendered that they seem to dissolve into the background as the eye attempts to focus upon them, though they were not so much painted as gently breathed onto the plaster by some long-departed hand. In the centre of the room, raised upon its own low platform and enclosed by its own gilded balustrade, stands the Queen's state bed, a structure even more elaborate in some ways than that of her royal husband. Its canopy is hung with curtains of pale silk, embroidered with extraordinary intricacy in flowers of every imaginable kind, peonies and tulips and forget-me-nots and small wild violets, all of them rendered in coloured silk so finely shaded that one might almost expect to detect the faint, sweet scent of the flowers themselves rising from the cloth. The bedposts are slender, gilded, twisted into forms suggestive of growing vines. From the centre of the canopy hangs a single great plume of white ostrich feathers fixed within a small gilded coronet, and these feathers stir very slowly in any draught that moves through the room, the long white fibres trembling almost imperceptibly, though the bed itself were drawing the slow patient breaths of a sleeper at rest. The morning ritual that unfolded within this chamber resembled in its outward structure the lever du roi, but it was carried out with notably less formal ceremony and notably more genuine intimacy. The Queen's first attendants were the dames d'honneur, the senior ladies of her household, drawn from the highest ranks of the French nobility, and they entered the chamber softly in the early hours of the morning to begin the slow process of preparing the Queen for her day. There was no large crowd of male officials, no procession of senior dignitaries waiting in attendance. There were only the ladies moving about their tasks with the gentle competence of those who had performed the same small rites 1,000 times before. A bowl of warm scented water was brought forth, much as it had been in the king's chamber. But the scent here was different, lighter, more floral, infused with the petals of fresh roses gathered before dawn from the Queen's private garden, and with a few drops of an essence distilled from neroli, the orange blossom oil that gave the water its particular bright sweetness. The Queen's hands and face were bathed gently with this water, dried with cloths of softest linen, and patted with a fine powder made from finely ground rice flour, scented faintly with iris root. Her hair was unpinned from its nighttime braid and combed slowly with a comb of polished tortoise shell, the long strokes of the comb drawing through her hair with a soft, almost meditative rhythm. Around the room the other ladies attended to the various small tasks that supported the morning ritual. One drew open the heavy curtains at the windows, but only partially, allowing the soft early light to enter the chamber gradually rather than all at once. Another tended the small fire in the marble hearth, adding gentle pieces of fragrant cherry wood and apple wood, whose wood smoke carried a faint sweet aroma quite unlike the heavier oak burned in the more public rooms. Another arranged upon a small writing desk the morning's correspondence, the letters from the Queen's mother in distant lands, the small notes from her ladies-in-waiting, the formal documents that required only the briefest of glances and the smallest of signatures. Upon a low table beside the bed stood the Queen's morning chocolate, a beverage that had become by this period the established preference of the royal women. The chocolate was prepared in a small kitchen, reserved exclusively for this purpose, where a particular officer of the household, the chocolatier de la reine, ground the cacao with sugar and a hint of vanilla and a small measure of crushed cinnamon, then whisked the mixture with hot water in a tall silver pot fitted with a wooden agitator that turned upon its axis. The result was a beverage of considerable richness and depth, dark brown, slightly thickened, with a soft white foam upon its surface and a fragrance so rich and warming that even the smallest cup seemed to fill the chamber with a sense of slow, patient comfort. The Queen would sip this chocolate slowly, propped against her pillows in the great bed, while around her the soft business of the morning continued. Letters might be read aloud to her by one of her ladies, the small news of distant courts conveyed in measured tones. Favourite small dog, a spaniel perhaps with long silken ears and a soft brown coat, might be permitted to curl upon the silken coverlet beside her, dozing in patient contentment. A small bird in a gilded cage near the window might whistle softly, catching the first warmth of the morning sun. After the chocolate had been finished and the cup carried away, the slow business of dressing would begin. The Queen's wardrobe was managed by a senior lady known as the Dame de Tours, the Lady of the Wardrobe, and this position was one of the most prestigious in the entire palace, conferring upon its holder both considerable income and the close personal attention of the Queen herself. Each morning the Dame de Tours would present to the Queen a leather-bound book containing small fabric swatches representing each of the gowns currently available within the royal wardrobe. The Queen would consider these swatches at her leisure, sometimes pausing for several minutes over a particular pattern, sometimes choosing without hesitation, and would indicate her selection with a small gesture of her hand or a soft word of preference. Once the gown had been chosen, it would be brought forth from the great wardrobe rooms upon a wheeled wooden frame, suspended upon a padded hanger of polished cedar wood. The dressing of the Queen was a slower and more elaborate process than that of the King, for the gowns of the period required considerable assistance to arrange properly, the chemise of fine linen first soft and gentle against the skin, then the corset laced with patient hands never too tightly, then the underskirts, layer upon layer of softer petticoats, each one rustling faintly as it was settled into place. Then the great gown itself, lifted with care and dropped slowly over her arms, its weight settling upon her shoulders as her ladies adjusted the long train, and arranged the falling pleats and smoothed the embroidered cuffs. By the time this slow ritual was complete, the morning sun had risen properly above the gardens beyond the windows, and the Queen, dressed and prepared, would step softly from her chamber to begin her own quiet round of the palace's daily life. Beyond the formal apartments of the Queen, tucked away from the great public chambers and reached only through a series of small, almost unremarkable doors, there existed a private world of considerable charm, world that the Queens of Versailles cultivated for themselves with great patience and considerable longing. It was a world composed of small interior gardens, of narrow stone terraces, of intimate cabinets where a queen might at last be alone with her own thoughts, and of the quieter pleasures that no public ceremony could provide. Let us drift gently into this world now, walking with that slow, soft step that becomes us in places where the air itself seems to insist upon hush. We pass through a small door set discreetly within the wall of the Queen's antechamber, its surface painted to match the surrounding panelling so closely that an inattentive eye would scarcely notice it. The door yields beneath the gentle press of our hand, and we step into a narrow passage of pale grey stone, lit by a single tall window that looks out upon an inner courtyard. The light here is cool and softly green, filtered through the leaves of a small tree that grows in a glazed clay pot upon the window-sill, a young lemon perhaps, or a delicate orange, its glossy leaves trembling in the faint draught that always seems to move through these hidden corridors. The passage descends by a short flight of shallow steps, each one carpeted in a worn strip of rose-coloured wool, and at the foot of these steps another small door opens, this time onto something quite unexpected. We find ourselves stepping into a small private garden, enclosed on every side by the high cream-coloured walls of the palace itself, a garden that few visitors to Versailles ever knew existed. It is perhaps 30 paces in length and 20 in breadth, a modest space by any architectural standard, but every square inch of it has been considered and tended with the most attentive care. The ground beneath our feet is laid in pale gravel, raked into the gentle parallel lines that French gardeners called pied de coq, the foot of rooster pattern, and the gravel makes a soft, comforting crunch beneath the slipper as one walks slowly along its winding paths. Along the centre of the garden stretches a small ornamental basin of carved stone, perhaps 15 feet in length and oval in shape, filled with still, dark water that reflects the pale sky above with the perfect clarity of polished glass. Within this basin, at intervals along its centre line, 3 small bronze fountains rise modestly above the surface, each one sculpted in the form of a lily pad, upon which a tiny frog sits in patient repose, water trickling from his small bronze mouth in a thin silver thread that returns to the basin below with a gentle, almost musical splashing. The sound is steady, repetitive, soothing in the way that all small fountains are soothing, a soft liquid heartbeat that fills the garden without overwhelming it. Around the basin, in carefully designed beds bordered by low hedges of clipped boxwood, grow the flowers and herbs that the Queen herself selected for this private retreat. There are roses, of course, several varieties of them. The great pale damask rose with its 100 soft petals, the deeper pink gallica, the small white rose of Provence with its musky scent. There are beds of lavender, low and silver grey, their blue-purple flower spikes rising in patient ranks above the soft mounded foliage. There are tall stalks of larkspur and delphinium in shades of celestial blue. There are mounds of sweet alyssum foaming softly white at the edges of the paths, and patches of mignonette whose unassuming green flowers release a fragrance entirely disproportionate to their modest appearance, a fragrance so soft and sweet that one wishes to breathe it in for several long, slow moments before moving onward. Along the walls of the garden, espaliered against the warm stone, grow fruit trees that have been trained patiently across many years into elaborate fan and palmette shapes. Peaches, apricots, fine pears with names long forgotten, their branches tied carefully to slender wooden frames with small loops of soft cotton twine. The ripening fruit upon these trees in late summer would be picked with great care by the Queen's own gardener and presented to her in small porcelain dishes, their skins still warm from the sun, their flesh sweeter than any market fruit could ever be, for they had grown in absolute privacy and absolute tenderness. In one corner of the garden, sheltered beneath the spreading branches of a young linden tree, stands a small pavilion of pale wood, its roof formed of overlapping shingles, its walls open to the air on 3 sides and closed only on the 4th, where a small wooden bench has been built into the wall and softened with cushions of pale rose silk. This is the Queen's reading pavilion, the small private place to which she might retreat with a book in the quiet hour after her midday meal, when the rest of the palace observed its slow, respectful pause, and the corridors fell into the contented hush of digestion. Imagine, for a moment, the Queen walking slowly through this garden in the soft golden light of late afternoon. Her gown is lighter than her morning gown, made of a simpler cotton lawn, rather than heavy silk, for she is alone here and need not dress for anyone but herself. Her hair has been loosened slightly from its formal arrangement, and a wide-brimmed hat of woven straw, tied beneath her chin with a soft pink ribbon, shields her face from the gentle sun. In one hand she carries a small basket of woven willow, in which she has placed a few cuttings from her favourite roses. In the other she carries a slim book bound in pale calfskin, its pages marked here and there with a dried flower or a small slip of folded paper. She walks slowly along the gravel path, pausing now and then to lean down and breathe in the fragrance of a particular flower, or to remove a small wilted leaf from the edge of a hedge. Her movements are unhurried, almost dreamlike, for in this small enclosed garden she is at last released, however briefly, from the perpetual observation that ruled every other hour of her existence. There are no spectators here. There are no courtiers waiting attentively for the smallest gesture of her hand. There is only the soft splashing of the small fountain, the distant call of a bird from somewhere beyond the walls, and the warm fragrance of roses rising patiently into the still afternoon air. She reaches the pavilion at last and settles herself upon the cushioned bench. Her book is opened upon her lap, its pages turning with slow patience under her gentle fingers. Perhaps she reads a few lines, then pauses, allowing her gaze to drift outward across the garden, then returns again to the page. Perhaps she does not read at all, but simply allows the book to lie open as a kind of permission to be still. The hours of the afternoon move very slowly here. The shadows of the linden tree shift gradually across the gravel paths. The small bronze frogs continue their patient work. Bee moves from one rose to another with that particular meandering thoughtfulness which bees always seem to possess, never hurried, never lost, always exactly where it intended to be. There were several such hidden gardens scattered throughout the palace grounds, each one designed to provide a particular kind of retreat. Some were larger, intended for small, intimate gatherings of 3 or 4 trusted companions. Some were smaller still, scarcely more than balconied alcoves with a single bench and a few potted herbs, intended for absolutely solitary reflection. Some were filled with flowers chosen for their medicinal properties, their leaves and petals harvested for tisanes and salves, and the small remedies prepared in the Queen's private apothecary. Some were filled with fragrant herbs chosen specifically for their effect upon the mind, the rosemary for clarity, the lemon balm for ease, the chamomile for the gentle slowing of an anxious heart. To know that such places existed within the palace, and to know that they were tended with as much patient care as the great public gardens beyond, is to understand something important about Versailles itself. For all its grand theatrical performances, for all its choreographed ceremonies and its public displays of magnificence, the palace also held within it these small, quiet, deeply human spaces, places where a sovereign could at last be simply a woman walking among her roses in the soft golden hour of an afternoon. And that, perhaps, was the most carefully guarded secret of the palace, the secret that even kings and queens require, from time to time, the simple, consoling pleasure of a small enclosed garden where nothing more is asked of them than to breathe. As the long afternoon of the palace drifted gently into the early hours of evening, and the slow blue dusk began to settle softly upon the gardens beyond the windows, a particular ritual would begin to unfold within certain rooms of the great central building, ritual of considerable charm and considerable importance. This was the hour of the court's diversions, the time when the courtiers and the visiting nobility, having concluded the more formal obligations of the day, would gather in designated salons to occupy themselves with the gentler pleasures of conversation, music, and above all the playing of cards. Let us drift now into one of these salons and observe, with our quiet, patient eyes, the slow choreography of an evening at the court of Versailles. The salon we have chosen is known as the Salon of Mercury, named for the painted figure of that swift-footed god who presides upon its central ceiling panel, holding aloft his caduceus of entwined serpents, while small painted clouds drift gently around his sandaled feet. The room is octagonal in its plan, with 4 arched alcoves set into its walls and 4 pier glasses set between them, so that the eye looking around encounters a soft alternation of painted recesses and silvered reflections that seems to multiply the room into a kind of patient infinity. The walls themselves are dressed in silk damask of a particular shade of warm coral, faded over the long centuries into a softer, more peach-like hue, and the gilded mouldings that divide the panels catch the candlelight in long, gentle ribbons of warm gold. The ceiling is one of the more elaborate compositions in the entire palace, depicting the chariot of Mercury drawn through a soft sky of dawn-coloured clouds by 2 great cockerels, their plumage rendered in tiny strokes of the palest pinks and silvers and dawn gold. Around this central scene, smaller panels depict various allegorical figures representing the arts and sciences over which Mercury was traditionally said to preside: the figure of eloquence reading from a small scroll, the figure of astronomy gazing patiently through a brass spyglass, the figure of music holding a small lyre against her shoulder while her fingers brush gently across its strings. The whole ceiling is bordered in a deep frame of carved and gilded plaster, the gilding old enough now that it has acquired the soft patina that only true age can confer, a warmth that no modern restoration could ever quite replicate. In the centre of the floor, set upon a great savonnerie carpet whose pattern of pale flowers and entwined ribbons echoes the design of the ceiling above, stand 4 card tables, each of them perfectly square, each of them covered with a smooth green baize cloth that has been brushed and pressed until its surface is as flat and as inviting as a still pond at dusk. The tables are made of a pale walnut, fitted at each corner with small recessed wells of polished silver in which the players might place their counters or their small porcelain cups of fortified wine. Around each table 4 chairs of gilded beechwood are set with precise symmetry, their seats and backs upholstered in the same coral silk that lines the walls. Upon each table is laid a fresh pack of playing cards, the cards themselves being objects of considerable beauty in this period, far removed from the cheap and mass-produced cards of the modern world. Each card has been printed by hand from carved wooden blocks, then painted in the rich colours of red and blue and gold and pale yellow that the French card makers had refined into something approaching an art. The face cards are particularly fine, the kings rendered with elaborate crowns and richly embroidered robes, the queens holding small flowers or sceptres, the knaves dressed in the costumes of various trades. The backs of the cards are decorated in a uniform pattern of small interlocking diamonds picked out in soft blues and greens that have been chosen specifically to hide any subtle wear that might, over the course of an evening's play, betray the value of a particular card. The games most favoured at the court of this period were of considerable variety. There was lansquenet, a game of considerable dash and considerable risk that flourished particularly among the younger gentlemen of the court, played with a single pack of cards and a small pile of golden counters that travelled around the table with each successive deal. There was reversis, a game requiring rather more thought and considerable patience, in which the object was, paradoxically, to take the fewest tricks rather than the most, and which therefore appealed particularly to those of a quiet and contemplative temperament. There was piquet, the long-favoured game of two players, in which a particular pack of 32 cards was used, and in which the players negotiated through several rounds of declaration and exchange before the actual play of cards began. But the great game of the period, the game that drew the largest crowds and the largest stakes and the most patient attention, was a game called cavagnole, a kind of stately ancestor of the modern lottery, played upon a long wooden board ornamented with numbered compartments. Small wooden balls, each one painted with a number, were drawn one by one from a small velvet bag, and the players placed their counters upon the corresponding compartments of the board, watching with quiet absorption as the balls emerged and the patterns of fortune slowly revealed themselves across the table. There was something deeply soothing in the slow, patient rhythm of this game, the soft rattling of the balls within the velvet bag, the gentle clicking as each ball was placed upon its appointed compartment, the soft murmurs of the players as they considered their next placement. Around the card tables the courtiers move with the slow grace that long custom has trained into them. They are dressed in their finest evening clothes, the gentlemen in coats of velvet or fine wool embroidered with silver and silk, the ladies in gowns of pale silk over wide-hooped petticoats, their hair dressed high and powdered to a soft white, with small ornamental flowers or jewelled clips set at intervals throughout the elaborate arrangement. The light from the chandeliers above falls upon them in soft golden pools, catching here a small diamond at a lady's throat, there the gleam of a silver buckle upon a gentleman's shoe, somewhere else the slow flutter of a fan painted with scenes of pastoral landscapes upon its delicate ivory ribs. Conversation moves quietly around the room, pitched at that particular level of soft murmur which long aristocratic tradition has refined into something almost musical, never loud enough to disturb a neighbouring table, never so quiet as to seem secretive or unfriendly. The topics of the evening are gentle, the small news of the court, the latest play observed at the theatre in the town below, the small triumph or small disappointment of a particular friend's recent promotion or appointment, the soft observations on the new fashions that have begun to arrive from the dressmakers of Paris. Politics, that more serious matter, is left for other rooms and other hours. Here, in the soft warmth of this candlelit salon, the talk is of the small pleasant matters that allow a long evening to pass with grace. At a small writing desk set against one wall, a footman in a coat of dark blue velvet stands quietly beside a silver tray, ready to refill the small porcelain cups of the players with whatever beverage they might prefer. There is a sweet wine of muscat, pale gold, and lightly perfumed. There is a darker wine of port, served in cups of pale crystal that warm gently in the hand. There is a small silver pot of coffee kept hot upon a tiny brazier of glowing charcoal, releasing into the air the soft, dark fragrance that had begun, in this period, to capture the attention of the European courts. There is a smaller silver pot of hot chocolate, scented with a hint of orange flower water. The footman moves between the tables when summoned, refilling each cup with a slow, practised motion, never spilling a single drop, never permitting his own face to register any expression beyond the practised neutrality that his position required. In a corner of the room, set within a small alcove half shielded by a draped curtain of pale silk, 3 musicians are quietly playing. There is a viola da gamba, its rich, low voice singing softly beneath the higher melodies of a flute and a small harpsichord whose strings produce that gentle, almost feathered tone for which this particular instrument was so loved. The music they play is unhurried, unobtrusive, intended not as a performance to be attended to, but as a soft atmospheric presence, a background warmth into which the conversation and the soft clicking of cards could settle without disruption. The hours of such an evening would pass very slowly indeed. By the time the great clock in the corner softly chimed the 11th hour, and the senior courtiers began to gather their small piles of counters and prepare for the gentle conclusion of the evening, the candles in the chandeliers above would have burned down by perhaps half their original length, and a soft drift of pale wax would have collected in the silver dishes set beneath them. The footmen would begin with quiet efficiency the slow business of clearing the tables, gathering the cards into their small lacquered boxes, smoothing the green baize for the morning, and the courtiers drifting toward the doors with their small murmured farewells would carry with them the warm, contented weariness of an evening well spent. Let us pause now, dear listener, in our slow wandering through the chambers and rituals of this great palace, and allow our thoughts to drift outward, beyond any particular room, beyond any particular ceremony, into a softer and more reflective contemplation of what such a place truly represents when one considers it across the long and patient span of its existence. For Versailles is not, after all, merely a building. Versailles is a meditation in stone, a vast and patient thought made permanent by the labour of human hands, and the deeper one considers it, the more one comes to understand that its true subject is time itself. Consider for a slow and softly drifting moment the great limestone walls that compose the outer fabric of this palace. The stone from which these walls were built was quarried in a region not far from Paris, in shallow open pits where men worked through the seasons with iron pickaxes and long wooden levers, lifting block after block from the patient earth and loading them onto great horse-drawn wagons that rolled slowly along the rutted roads toward the building site. Each block of stone, once it had been quarried, was a small piece of compressed time, formed across millions of years from the slow accumulation of tiny marine creatures whose shells had drifted to the bottom of an ancient sea, settling layer upon layer, hardening eventually into the soft, pale, easily worked stone that the French masons so prized. To lay one's hand upon such a wall is therefore to touch, however briefly, the sediment of an unimaginably distant world, a world of warm, shallow seas and small drifting lives that had long since receded into geological memory. The masons who shaped these blocks worked with a patience that the modern world has all but forgotten. Each stone was first roughed into approximate shape with a heavy iron pick, the great chips falling away in coarse flakes that piled at the workers' feet. Then it was refined with a chisel and mallet, the chisel held at a precise angle and struck with a gentle, regular rhythm that produced a steady musical clinking sound, a sound that would have filled the great construction yards of Versailles for years upon years upon years. Then the stone was smoothed with a finer chisel still, the strokes growing shorter and more delicate as the surface approached its final geometry. Then, at last, it was rubbed with a coarse, abrasive sand and water until the final surface emerged, smooth enough to satisfy the eye, but still bearing, if one looked closely, the faint diagonal striations of the abrasive's last passage. Each block, having been so prepared, was then lifted into its place upon the rising wall by means of a great wooden crane operated by men walking in a kind of patient circular tread within an enormous wheel, much like a hamster within its little spinning toy, except that these men were full-grown labourers, and their wheel was 20 feet in diameter, and the load it lifted was several tons of carefully shaped stone. Up the stones rose, slowly and carefully, swinging gently upon their hempen ropes, until they were guided into their precise positions by the masons above, and bedded into thin layers of lime mortar that had been mixed that very morning with sand and water and slaked lime. Once set, each stone became a small permanent participant in the architectural composition of the whole, locked into its neighbours by the patient logic of weight and friction, contributing its small particular share to the total stability of the rising structure. Reflect, then, upon what it means to stand within a building so constructed. Every single stone you can see has been touched by human hands, lifted, shaped, considered, set into its place. Every single stone has remained exactly where it was placed for more than 3 centuries, supporting the stones above it, supported by the stones below it, contributing its small invisible labor to the ongoing existence of the whole. The walls that surround you are the cumulative result of millions of human gestures. Gestures performed by men whose names are mostly forgotten, whose individual contributions cannot be traced, whose lives have long since passed into the same soft anonymity that absorbs all human lives in time. And yet their work persists, their patience endures, the walls still stand. There is in this persistence something deeply consoling. Our own lives, when we consider them in the harsher light of waking hours, often seem fleeting and uncertain, our small daily efforts vanishing into the ceaseless current of time without leaving any visible mark upon the world. But here, in this palace, one walks among walls that prove the opposite. The patient work of human hands can endure. The small, careful gesture, repeated many times, can accumulate into something larger than itself, can outlast the workers, can persist for centuries beyond the moment of its making. Consider, too, the slow weathering of the stone over those centuries. When these walls were first completed, the limestone was a brilliant, almost dazzling cream, so pale and so fresh that the palace seemed almost to glow against the surrounding gardens. Across the long years, however, the stone has aged. It has accepted into itself the soft staining of rain and wood smoke and the patient breath of the seasons. Where the wind has brushed most steadily against a particular wall, the surface has acquired a faint silver-grey patina. Where rainwater has channeled gently down beside a window, a thin, dark stripe has developed, scarcely darker than the surrounding stone, but darker enough to be noticed by the patient eye. Each of these small markings is a record, a soft archaeological document inscribed by weather upon the building's outer skin, telling the slow story of 3 centuries of wind and rain and quiet sunlit afternoons. Step closer in your imagination to one of these weathered walls and consider the small life that has colonized the surface of the stone itself. There are tiny lichens here, pale green and silvery and rusty orange, growing in slow expanding circles upon the limestone wherever a north-facing surface has remained sufficiently damp for their patient accumulation. Lichens grow with extraordinary slowness, perhaps a single millimetre across in the space of a year, and the larger circles upon these walls are therefore decades old, perhaps centuries old, small living calendars that have measured out the years with the soft accuracy of their patient expansion. To brush one's fingertip lightly across such a lichen is to touch a slowness so profound that it defies the modern understanding of time entirely. The lichen knows nothing of our hurried lives. The lichen continues year by patient year, doing what it has always done, asking nothing more of the world than the soft persistence of damp stone and gentle weather. Reflect also upon the quality of permanence that such a building possesses, and consider what it means to construct anything with such a long view of the future. The architects and masons who built Versailles did not expect to see its completion within their own lifetimes. They worked with the certainty that their labour would be carried forward by the next generation, and the generation after that, and the generation after that, until at last the building stood complete in some distant century that they themselves would not live to witness. There is a particular kind of patience in such an undertaking, a patience that requires the relinquishment of personal ownership over the work, the willingness to contribute one's labour to a project whose final shape one will never see. This patience is perhaps one of the gentlest and most underappreciated of human virtues. It asks us to work for the benefit of those we will never meet, to add our small gestures to a slow accumulation that extends both backward into the past and forward into the unknown future. There is something deeply restful, dear listener, in the contemplation of such patience. Our own moment, our own day, our own particular concerns and hurries and small worries dissolve gently when set against the long, slow patience of these walls. The stone does not hurry, the lichen does not hurry, the slow accumulation of weathering does not hurry. And tonight, drifting softly through these patient corridors, perhaps we too can release a little of our own hurry, can settle into the slower rhythm of the stone, can allow ourselves to belong briefly and gently, a kind of time that is older and quieter and more forgiving than the time of our usual days. The walls have been here long before us. The walls will remain long after us, and in this moment, in this hush, the walls offer us the soft, patient gift of their own example. Let us continue our soft drift through the patient hours of the night, and turn our minds now to a subject that the great palace seems to hold within its very fabric, a subject that arises naturally from the contemplation of any place so carefully and so lovingly made. It is the question of beauty itself, and of what it means to live in the slow, patient inheritance of things made beautifully by the hands of those who came before us. Consider, for a long and softly drifting moment, the simple truth that almost everything you have seen this evening was made by human hands. The marble floor beneath us, with its precise alternation of pale ivory and deep blue-grey, was laid stone by craftsmen working with chisels and mallets and small wooden trowels of lime mortar. The painted ceiling above us, with its fading gods and dusty cherubs and gentle ornamental clouds, was applied stroke by painters lying upon their backs, upon high wooden scaffolds, brushes held in cramping fingers, eyes squinting against the small drips of paint that occasionally fell toward them. The gilded mouldings that frame each panel were modelled in damp plaster by sculptors who shaped each curl of acanthus leaf with their thumbs and the small wooden tools of their trade, then gilded by patient artisans applying gold leaf so thin that a single sneeze could ruin half a morning's work. Every door, every window frame, every brass keyhole, and every small carved cherub had its origin in some particular workshop, was carried out by some particular pair of hands, was finished and polished and brought to its final state of grace through the sustained attention of human beings whose names in most cases we will never know. To walk through this palace is therefore to walk through a kind of cathedral of forgotten labour, a vast and quiet monument to the cumulative skill of generations of craftsmen who placed their gifts at the service of a project that would outlast them entirely. Reflect, then, upon the great quiet generosity of this inheritance. The craftsmen who built this palace built it not for themselves, but for the future generations who would walk through these rooms long after they themselves had passed into the silence beyond their lives. Every carved curl of acanthus leaf, every patient polishing of a marble surface, every careful application of pigment to plaster, was a gift given freely into the keeping of the future. And we, drifting now through these corridors 3 centuries later, are the recipients of that gift. We did not earn it, we did not commission it, we did not pay for it with the labour of our own days, and yet here it is all around us, the patient bequest of those who came before, offered to us simply because we happen to be alive in a moment when these walls still stand. This is perhaps the deepest meaning of any inheritance of beauty. It teaches us that we are not, after all, the centre of the world. We are the inheritors of a world that was already beautiful before we arrived, made beautiful by people whose names we do not know, whose lives we cannot reconstruct, whose particular hopes and disappointments and small daily concerns have long since dissolved into the general silence of the past. Our task, if we have one, is not to add ourselves to that beauty as though it had been waiting for our particular contribution. Our task is simply to receive it, to walk through it gently, to allow it to soften the edges of our hurry and to remind us that we belong to a continuity larger than the small bright moment of our own existence. Consider in this quiet light the particular role of the small unnoticed details that fill this palace, the little carved rosettes in the corners of ceilings, set so high above the floor that almost no one ever looks at them, the intricate inlay of a wooden floor in a room rarely entered, the tiny painted scene tucked into the upper panel of a door that opens many times each day without anyone pausing to consider what is painted there. These small details were made with the same patient care as the more famous and more visible portions of the building, and yet they exist almost entirely beyond ordinary attention. The craftsmen who made them knew surely that most of their work would never be properly seen. They made it beautifully anyway. They lavished upon it the same attention they lavished upon the most prominent features. They believed in some quiet and unstated way that beauty deserved to be made beautifully, whether or not it would be observed. There is a profound philosophy embedded in this practice, a philosophy that the modern world has perhaps largely forgotten. It holds that beauty is not a transaction. Beauty does not require an audience to justify its existence. Beauty, when it is made well, is its own sufficient reason. The small carved rosette tucked into the dim upper corner of a forgotten room is no less a triumph for being unseen, no less worthy of patient craftsmanship, no less a participant in the larger symphony of the palace itself. To work in this spirit is to work as though the universe itself were the audience, and the universe, of course, has all the time in the world to notice. There is a wonderful softness in receiving this lesson, dear listener, and in allowing it to settle into the deepest layers of one's own thinking. The day from which you have come, with all its small urgent demands and its anxious comparisons and its perpetual sense that one must be doing something visible to justify one's existence, recedes a little further as the lesson takes hold. The patient anonymous craftsmen of the 17th century are perhaps your gentlest teachers in this particular hour. They worked patiently, they worked beautifully, they worked without expecting recognition, and the work they made 3 centuries later continues to serve as a soft and steady consolation for those who happen to drift through it on quiet evenings such as this one. To inherit beauty is therefore to inherit also a particular kind of kindness, the kindness of those who long ago chose to make things well even when they could have made them merely adequate, the kindness of those who refused to cut corners even where the corners would never be seen, the kindness of those who placed their patient gifts at the service of a future they would not live to see. We walk among these gifts tonight. We breathe the soft air that the gifts have made beautiful, and we in our turn may perhaps offer something of the same kindness onward into the soft unknown future that lies beyond our own lives, simply by living a little more patiently, a little more gently, a little more generously in honor of the patient ones who came before. Allow your thoughts to drift now into a still gentler reflection, dear listener, into a contemplation of something perhaps the most ephemeral of all the elements that once filled this great palace, something that no marble can preserve and no painted ceiling can record. Let us think together about the music of Versailles, not the famous compositions that are still performed today, but the smaller, quieter, more domestic music that filled these rooms in the slow hours when no audience was assembled and no formal concert was scheduled, when music existed simply as the soft accompaniment of daily life, rather than as a celebrated performance to be recorded and remembered. This continuous soft music, this gentle background tide of patient practice and idle improvisation, formed a kind of audible inheritance, a sonic atmosphere that no recording survived to preserve and that exists today only in our patient imagination. We can never know the precise quality of those long-vanished sounds, but we can reconstruct in our quietness something of what they must have offered to the daily life of the palace. The harpsichord of the period, with its bright and slightly metallic plucking sound, would have produced a music quite different from the warmer, more sustained tones of the modern piano. The flute was slimmer, breathier, made of dark seasoned wood rather than polished silver, and its voice was softer and more conversational than the powerful instrument of later centuries. The viola da gamba, beloved instrument of the court, sang in a low, mellow register that has been almost entirely lost from modern ensembles, its tone described by those who heard it as resembling the human voice in its capacity for tender expression. Imagine, then, walking through this palace on an unhurried afternoon and hearing, without quite being able to locate them, the small fragments of music that drifted continually through the building. From one direction, a single recorder might be playing a slow pastoral air, the notes rising and falling with the patient simplicity that was the period's particular gift. From another direction, a harpsichord might be working through a small ornamented prelude, the same passage repeated 3 or 4 times as the player refined some particular detail of fingering or expression. From a still further room, a soft duet for 2 voices might emerge, 2 ladies of the court practicing a recently arrived chanson, their voices blending and parting in the gentle dance of an early 18th century melody. There is a particular quality to such music, a quality that the modern ear must work patiently to recover. The music of this period was composed almost invariably for the small chamber rather than the great concert hall, for the intimate listener rather than the assembled audience. It was music intended to accompany conversation, to soften the edges of an afternoon, to provide a gentle current beneath the social activities of the room rather than to demand attention as the central event. This is sometimes called musique d'ameublement, furniture music, although the term itself is of much later origin. The principle, however, is ancient. Music could be a kind of acoustic furnishing, a soft and beautiful presence that enhanced the room without dominating it, much as a fine carpet or a well-chosen tapestry might enhance a chamber without insisting upon being the centre of attention. Pause for a moment now and consider how rare such music has become in the modern world. Our music, for the most part, demands attention. It is amplified, it is foregrounded, it is designed to capture and hold the listener's focus. The idea of music as a soft companion, a gentle background presence that one might attend to or not as one wished, has largely vanished from our daily experience. And yet within this palace, in those long and patient afternoons of 3 centuries past, music existed precisely in this gentler register, drifting through rooms like the soft scent of a distant flower, present without being insistent, beautiful without being demanding. The instruments themselves were objects of considerable beauty. Beyond the music they produced, the harpsichord that stood in the Queen's private cabinet was a work of fine cabinetry, as much as of musical engineering. Its long curved case was made of seasoned cherry wood, polished to a deep, glowing reddish brown that caught the candlelight in soft, warm reflections. Its keyboard, of pale boxwood for the natural keys and dark ebony for the accidentals, was bordered by a delicate inlay of mother of pearl. Its painted lid bore upon its inner surface a small landscape of pastoral figures dancing in a meadow before a distant temple, a scene executed in the soft chalky tones beloved of period ornamental painters. To open such an instrument was to reveal a small private theatre, a hidden world whose surfaces were as carefully considered as its musical capacities. The lute, that gentlest of stringed instruments, was an object of even more astonishing craftsmanship. Its rounded body was made of many narrow strips of pale wood, glued together along their edges to form the soft curving teardrop shape that was its signature silhouette. The strips were chosen for their varying tones of cream and tan and amber, and the assembled body therefore possessed a subtle striped pattern that ran along its surface like the stripes of a soft seashell. The neck of the lute was inlaid with intricate patterns of mother of pearl and dark wood, and the great rose hole at the centre of the soundboard was carved into a delicate filigree of geometric and floral patterns, so fine that the eye could scarcely follow them all. The strings themselves of twisted gut were strung at a tension considerably gentler than that of any modern instrument, producing a sound described by those who heard it as resembling the fall of soft rain upon a stone terrace. There was also the small portable harp, the harpe d'amore, an instrument particularly favoured by the ladies of the court. It stood perhaps 3 feet in height, its frame of carved and gilded wood, its strings of fine sheep gut producing a soft, sweet voice that suited the intimate scale of the chambers in which it was played. Such a harp would be carried into a private salon by a young lady of the household, settled upon a small footstool, and played for the quiet pleasure of 2 or 3 friends gathered for an afternoon's conversation. The music thus produced was rarely written down, rarely performed publicly, rarely recorded in any form that could survive to the present day. It existed in the moment of its making and then dissolved gently into the silence of the afternoon, leaving behind only the contented memory of having been heard. Reflect for a moment upon the strange and tender mortality of music. The walls of this palace persist. The painted ceilings persist, the marble floors and the gilded mouldings and the silken hangings persist, in some form or another, across the centuries. But the music that filled these rooms is gone entirely beyond all hope of recovery. Each note, sounded once and allowed to fade, vanished forever into the air of its particular afternoon, and no patient archaeology can ever reconstruct the precise sound of any single note as it actually was. We have the scores, we have descriptions, we have replicas of the instruments, but the actual sound, the particular trembling of the air on a particular Tuesday afternoon in 1748, that sound has dissolved utterly into silence. There is in this thought both a soft sadness and a soft consolation. The sadness lies in the realization that so much of the beauty of human life is fundamentally ephemeral, written upon air and water rather than upon stone, available only in the moment of its making and never afterward. The consolation lies in the realization that the ephemerality is itself a kind of grace. Music does not need to last in order to have mattered. The afternoon harp lesson of a young lady 3 centuries ago mattered fully and completely in its own moment. Its dissolution into silence does not diminish its having been beautiful while it lasted. The small notes were sounded, were heard, were enjoyed by those present. That was enough. That has always been enough. The music did not require permanence in order to justify itself, and in this it teaches us perhaps the gentlest of lessons about our own small fleeting moments, our own afternoon hours, our own soft and unrecorded pleasures, all of which are sufficient simply by being lived. Allow your thoughts now to drift one step further along the patient current we have been following, into a meditation perhaps the gentlest of all those we shall consider tonight. Let us think slowly, dear listener, about the soft and inevitable vanishing of all things, and about how the great palace, for all its magnificence and all its careful preservation, is itself a quiet teacher of this universal lesson, and how learning the lesson well can bring us, surprisingly, not sorrow, but a deep and abiding peace. Consider for a long, unhurried moment how thoroughly the world of the 18th century court has vanished. The kings and queens and princes are gone. The courtiers in their embroidered coats and their powdered wigs are gone. The footmen who carried the silver platters are gone. The chambermaids who climbed the hidden staircases in the dim hour before dawn are gone. The gardeners who clipped the boxwood hedges into their precise geometric shapes are gone. The musicians who tuned their lutes in the quiet alcoves of the salons are gone. The cooks who simmered the patient sauces in the great copper pans of the underground kitchens are gone. Every single human being whose daily existence once filled these rooms with movement and voice and small purpose has long since departed into the soft silence beyond their lives. And yet the rooms themselves remain. The walls still stand. The painted ceilings still drift their faded clouds. The mirrors still hold their patient silvered reflections. The floors still gleam beneath the slow accumulation of 3 centuries of footsteps. The persistence of the rooms in the absence of the people who once filled them creates a particular kind of quietness, a quietness that is not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of an enormous patient memory. The rooms remember the people in some sense that we cannot quite articulate. The walls have absorbed the murmured conversations, the soft laughter, the quiet weeping, the patient breathing of all those countless human beings who once moved through them. The walls hold this memory not as we hold memories, in the form of conscious recollection, but as old wood holds the warmth of the morning sun, simply by having been present, simply by having absorbed what was offered into the very fabric of their being. To stand within such a room late at night in the long hush after all human activity has receded is to participate in this slow and patient remembering. We do not need to know the names of those who once stood where we now stand. We do not need to reconstruct their particular faces or their particular concerns or their particular small daily worries. We need only to allow ourselves to be present in the same space they once occupied, breathing the same patient air, hearing the same distant ticking of the same patient clocks, and the connection establishes itself without any effort of our own. We are linked to them, softly and invisibly, by the simple fact of having stood however briefly in the place where they once stood. Reflect upon what this connection means. The people of the 18th century court did not, in their own time, consider themselves to be living in a vanishing world. To them, the present moment was as solid and as urgent and as pressing as our own present moment is to us. They worried about their reputations, their fortunes, their small social rivalries, their hopes for their children, their fears about their health, their questions about the meaning of their own lives. They believed, as we believe, that their particular moment mattered enormously, that the small dramas of their daily existence carried real weight in the larger order of the world. And in some sense they were correct. The dramas did matter. The hopes and the fears and the patient daily efforts were not in vain. But they have also, almost entirely dissolved into the soft general silence that absorbs all human moments in time. Now consider, with the gentlest possible touch, that we ourselves are participants in the same slow process. The day from which we have come, with all its small urgencies and its particular concerns, is itself in the slow process of becoming a vanished day. The current decade will, in time, become as remote and as half-imagined as the 18th century is to us now. The small worries that we carried into this evening, the things that seemed so pressing only a few hours ago, will eventually dissolve into the same general silence that has absorbed every other human worry across every other human century. This thought, surprisingly, need not be alarming. It is, properly considered, one of the most consoling thoughts available to a tired mind at the end of a long day. For if all things eventually dissolve into silence, then the small worry that has been keeping us awake also eventually dissolves. The disagreement we had at work this afternoon eventually dissolves. The unanswered email, the difficult conversation, the small social anxiety, the persistent question about whether we said the right thing at the right time, all of these eventually dissolve. They do not last. They cannot last. The slow, patient current of time carries them away, just as it has carried away every other human worry across every other human century. And the carrying away is not a tragedy but a soft mercy. We are not asked to hold these worries forever. We are not required to make them permanent. We are permitted in the end to release them into the same gentle silence that has received the worries of all those who came before us. Walk slowly now in your imagination into one of the smaller and less famous rooms of this palace, a room that has not been included on the official tours, a room where almost no visitor ever sets foot. The room is rectangular, perhaps 15 feet by 20, with a single tall window facing east and a small marble fireplace set into the wall opposite. The walls are lined with shelves of dark walnut, originally intended to hold books or perhaps small porcelain figurines, but now empty, the shelves bearing only the soft accumulation of the slow patient dust that gathers in any room left long undisturbed. A single small wooden chair sits in the centre of the floor, and beside it a small round table upon which rests, for some forgotten reason, a single brass candlestick with a stub of unlit wax candle. Stand quietly in this room for a few slow moments. There is nothing to look at, nothing to admire, nothing to record. The room offers no famous painting, no celebrated piece of furniture, no architectural feature of particular historical importance. The room offers only itself, its quiet emptiness, its patient dust, its soft eastern light, its slow accumulation of 3 centuries of being unattended. And yet there is something deeply restful in such a room, something that the more famous chambers cannot quite provide. The room is, in a sense, more honest than its grander neighbours. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. It accepts its own quiet emptiness without complaint. It allows itself to be unimportant. There is a wonderful gentleness in being unimportant, dear listener, and the room can perhaps teach this to anyone willing to stand patiently within it. The room does not strive, the room does not perform, the room does not attempt to justify its existence by being noticed or admired. The room simply exists, breathing the slow patient air of its own quiet, and in this simplicity it offers a kind of permission to those who enter it, permission to set down, however briefly, the heavy invisible burden of always needing to matter, permission to allow one's own small moment to be exactly as small as it actually is, permission to participate in the slow universal vanishing without feeling diminished by the participation. For the slow universal vanishing is not in the end a tragedy. It is the very condition that makes our small moments precious. If everything lasted forever, nothing would be particularly meaningful because there would be no scarcity, no edge, no sense in which the present moment is the only place where life can actually be lived. The vanishing creates the meaning. The fact that this evening will, in time, dissolve into the soft general silence is precisely what makes this evening worth attending to now. We are not asked to make the evening permanent. We are asked only to be present within it, to receive what it offers, to allow ourselves to belong to it for the brief, soft hour of its actual existence. The palace itself, with its empty rooms and its dust-softened shelves and its patient unattended corridors, offers this lesson without ever speaking it aloud. It has watched 3 centuries of human moments rise and fade. It has welcomed countless guests and outlived them all. It has accepted the soft truth that everything passes, and in accepting this truth it has become, paradoxically, a place of profound consolation. The peace one feels here, late at night, is the peace of a teacher who has long since made peace with the lesson he is offering, and we, drifting softly through these rooms, are perhaps becoming gentler students of that lesson with every quiet step we take. The hour, dear listener, has grown very late indeed. The candles in the great chandeliers above us have burned down to small soft stubs, their flames trembling gently within the cool draughts that drift through the patient corridors. The moonlight that earlier filled the long gallery with its silvered radiance has shifted now to a paler, softer glow, the moon herself sinking slowly toward the horizon beyond the gardens. Everything within the palace has settled into the deepest quiet of the night, the kind of quiet that arrives only in the small, slow hours after midnight, when even the patient ticking of the clocks seems to grow softer, more distant, more dreamlike. Let us walk now, very slowly, through one final passage of this long and gentle journey. We move along a softly carpeted corridor, our footsteps making almost no sound at all, our shadows stretching long and wavering upon the cream-coloured walls beside us. The air around us is cool and still, scented faintly with the lingering ghost of beeswax candles and the soft breath of old polished wood. Somewhere in the distance, very faintly, we can hear the slow, patient ticking of a clock, its small wooden heartbeat measuring out the long minutes of the night with the unhurried regularity of all such old timekeepers. We pass an open doorway and glance softly inside. The room beyond is empty, lit only by the silvered moonlight that falls through a tall arched window, and within that pale rectangle of light, a few slow motes of dust drift gently upward, turning and tumbling in the soft, warm currents of air, each one catching the moonlight for a single trembling moment before disappearing again into the surrounding shadow. We pause for a long moment watching the slow, patient dance of these dust motes, allowing our eyes to follow their gentle drifting, and we notice that our breathing has slowed almost without our noticing, falling into the same patient, unhurried rhythm as the motes themselves. We continue along the corridor. We pass another door and another, each one slightly ajar, each one offering a softly glimpsed view of an empty patient room. In one room, a tall standing clock chimes softly 3 muted notes that seem to come from very far away. In another, a small white moth has drifted in through some unsealed window, and now flutters quietly against the glass, its small wings making the faintest possible whisper of sound. In another, a single white candle has been left burning upon a small table, its flame steady and unhurried, casting its soft amber glow upon the polished surface of the wood, illuminating nothing in particular, asking for no audience, simply burning patiently because that is what candles are made to do. The slowness of these patient images settles into us as we walk, the dust motes drifting in the moonlight, the soft chime of a distant clock, the patient flutter of a moth against a window, the small steady flame of an unattended candle. Each of these tiny patient things asks nothing of us, demands nothing, performs nothing. Each of them simply continues, in its own quiet way, doing what it has always done, asking only that we receive its small gentle presence into our own patient awareness. We pass into a long gallery whose walls are hung with portraits of those who have lived within these walls across the long centuries. The faces in the portraits are dim now, half dissolved into the surrounding shadow. Only the pale ovals of their faces and the soft gleams of their painted jewellery catching the moonlight. They watch us pass with the quiet patience that all portraits possess, neither approving nor disapproving, simply present, simply observing the slow continuation of the world that they themselves have left behind. We acknowledge them with a soft inward bow, a small gentle recognition that they too once walked through these corridors as we now walk, that they too once felt the cool patient air upon their faces, that they too once drifted slowly towards sleep at the end of a long day. We come at last to a small doorway set discreetly into the wall, and we step softly through it into a chamber that has been waiting for us all along. This is a small private bedchamber, modest by the standards of the palace, but considerably more comfortable than any modern hotel room could ever hope to be. The walls are hung with silk of the softest, palest blue, embroidered with small drifting clouds in threads of paler silver. The ceiling above is painted in a continuous soft gradient from deeper blue at the corners to almost white at the centre, suggesting the gentle clarity of a summer sky just before dawn. The floor is laid with a thick carpet of pale rose and pale cream, woven in a soft pattern of drifting flowers, and the carpet is so deep beneath the foot that one's footsteps make absolutely no sound at all. In the centre of the room, set against the wall opposite the door, stands a small canopied bed. It is not the great state bed of a king or queen, but a more modest piece intended for the comfort of a single sleeper. Its 4 slender posts are carved of pale beechwood gently turned, and the canopy above is hung with curtains of soft cream linen embroidered with the most delicate possible tracery of leaves. The bedclothes are turned down in patient invitation, revealing crisp white sheets of fine linen, several layers of soft woolen blankets in varying shades of pale ivory, and an enormous puffed coverlet of pale blue silk filled with the lightest possible down. 2 pillows rest at the head of the bed, each one stuffed with goose down so soft and so abundant that they retain only the faintest memory of the heads that have last lain upon them. Beside the bed, a small table holds a porcelain pitcher of cool water, a glass of clear crystal, a single small candle in a brass holder, and a tiny bowl of dried lavender whose patient fragrance fills the surrounding air with a soft, sweet, almost herbal calm. The window beyond the bed is partially open, allowing the cool night air to drift gently into the room, carrying with it the distant scent of jasmine from the gardens below and the faint mineral coolness of the marble fountains. Pale curtain of soft linen has been drawn part way across the window, softening the moonlight that enters into a gentle silvered glow that pools upon the foot of the bed. Approach the bed slowly now in your patient imagination. Allow yourself to consider sitting upon its edge, feeling the gentle yielding of the mattress beneath you, the warm acceptance of the down coverlet, the cool, smooth touch of the linen sheets. Allow yourself to consider lying back slowly against the deep softness of the pillows, feeling them adjust beneath your head with that particular cradling quality that only true goose down can provide. Allow yourself to consider drawing the soft coverlet up to your shoulders, settling your hands gently upon the soft silk surface, releasing the long, patient breath that you have, perhaps, been holding for longer than you realized. The room around you continues its quiet, patient existence. The candle flame trembles gently in the soft draught from the window. The lavender in its small bowl releases its slow herbal fragrance into the cool night air. The clock, somewhere in the distance, ticks softly, slowly, marking out the patient minutes of the long night. The moonlight upon the foot of the bed shifts very gradually as the moon herself continues her slow descent toward the horizon, and the silvered glow softens almost imperceptibly into something paler still. You are safe here, dear listener. There is nothing in this room that asks anything of you. There is nothing in this palace that demands your attention. The night is long and patient. The bed is soft and welcoming. The air is cool and gently fragrant. The day from which you have come, with all its small urgencies and its particular concerns, has receded entirely into the soft general silence that absorbs all days in their proper time. The worries that travelled with you into the evening have, by now, dissolved softly into the patient dust motes drifting in the moonlight, into the slow ticking of the distant clock, into the gentle flutter of the moth against the window. They cannot follow you here. They are not permitted in this quiet place. Allow your eyes to close, slowly, gently, with that soft natural movement that requires no effort at all. Allow your breath to settle into its own deep, unhurried rhythm. Allow the soft cradling of the pillows and the warm acceptance of the coverlet to support every inch of your weary body. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to remember. There is nothing that requires your attention now. The palace continues its patient breathing all around you. The moonlight continues its slow descent, the clock continues its quiet, measured ticking, and you, drifting now into the soft, warm darkness of approaching sleep, are gently absorbed into the larger patience of the night. Stay where you are, dear listener, settled deep within the soft cradling of the pillows, wrapped gently in the warm acceptance of the coverlet. There is no need to move, no need to think, no need to do anything at all. The slow, patient palace continues its gentle breathing all around you, and you blessedly are permitted now to do nothing more than rest. Let us drift together through the final soft images of this long evening, allowing each one to settle slowly into your patient awareness, asking nothing more of you than to receive them as they pass. The dust motes drift slowly in the silvered moonlight, turning softly in the cool, patient air. The candle flame trembles gently within its brass holder, casting its small, warm glow upon the polished wood of the bedside table. The lavender in its little bowl releases its slow, sweet fragrance into the surrounding air. The patient herbal calm of it settling softly upon your shoulders, your eyelids, your slowing breath. The clock somewhere in the distance ticks softly. Each small wooden note arrives without urgency, without insistence, without any expectation that you will attend to it. The notes simply continue as they have continued for centuries, marking out the patient hours of the long night. You may listen to them if you wish, or you may allow them to fade gently into the larger quiet of the room. There is no right way to hear them. They are simply present, like the soft rain upon a roof, like the distant whisper of leaves in a summer breeze, like the patient breathing of an old companion sleeping nearby. The moonlight upon the foot of the bed has softened further now, shifting from silver toward the palest possible cream. Beyond the window, the moon herself has sunk lower in the sky, drifting toward the patient horizon, where she will eventually disappear into the soft coming dawn. But that dawn is still far away. The night is long and patient. There is no hurry. There is so much rest still ahead of you, so many quiet hours in which the slow, patient world will simply continue without asking anything of you at all. Imagine for a long, unhurried moment that you are floating gently upon the surface of a deep, warm, perfectly still lake. The water beneath you holds you up effortlessly, supporting every inch of your weight, asking nothing of your muscles, allowing you to float without any effort whatsoever. The water is the exact temperature of your own skin, neither cool nor warm, simply present, simply supporting you. Above you the sky is the soft, deep blue of a summer twilight, and a few small stars have begun to appear, drifting into visibility with the slow, patient grace of all gentle things. There is no shore in sight. There is no destination. There is only the patient water beneath you and the patient sky above you and your own soft floating between them. Allow your patient breath to settle into the rhythm of the lake itself, the very slow rise and fall of its surface as it breathes its own deep, unhurried breath. In, slowly, out, slowly, in, slowly, out, slowly. There is no need to control the breath, no need to deepen it or slow it deliberately. The breath knows what to do. The breath has known what to do for as long as you have been alive. Allow the breath simply to continue in its own patient wisdom without any interference from the part of you that thinks. The patient palace around you breathes in the same slow rhythm. The marble floors, the painted ceilings, the silken curtains, the gilded mouldings, all of them participating in the same patient, unhurried breathing of the long, quiet night. The dust motes drift, the candle flame trembles, the clock ticks softly, the moonlight pales gradually toward dawn. Everything continues in its own quiet way, without urgency, without insistence, without any expectation that you will participate. You are permitted blessedly to do nothing more than rest. Let the soft images of this long journey drift gently through your awareness one final time, each one passing softly without lingering, each one releasing you a little more deeply into the warm darkness of approaching sleep. The great gilded gates with their soft hammered gold leaf, glowing faintly in the lantern light. The vast forecourt with its pale cobblestones, the moonlight pooling silver in the small puddles between the stones. The cool marble of the entrance vestibule, black and white in its patient checkerboard. The small lantern turning slowly upon its iron chain. The hidden stairway behind the tapestry of Diana, its dark oak treads worn into a soft central groove by 3 centuries of patient footsteps. The narrow servants' corridor with its iron candle holders and its small numbered doors, its patient cream-coloured walls absorbing the soft amber glow of the candles. Drift further. The hall of mirrors in the silvered moonlight, its 17 great mirrored arches holding the soft, dreamlike fragments of 3 centuries of reflection. The crimson bedchamber of the king with its enormous canopied bed, its damask walls breathing their slow, warm exhalation in the dim hour before dawn. The dressing closet with its silver basins and its tiny porcelain pots, its patient brushes and its polished combs of tortoiseshell. The vast, warm kitchens with their long brick ranges and their gleaming copper pans, their patient sauces simmering across the slow hours of the afternoon. The dining chamber with its green baize-covered tables, its tall candles in their gilded sconces, its quiet, murmuring courtiers in their embroidered evening clothes. Drift further still. The Queen's chamber in its pale celadon green, the great plume of white ostrich feathers trembling above the canopied bed, the hidden garden with its small ornamental basin and its 3 little bronze frogs, the sweet alyssum foaming softly white at the edges of the gravel paths, the salon of Mercury with its painted ceiling and its quiet card tables, its soft musical murmuring drifting through the warm candlelit air, the patient empty rooms with their dust-softened shelves, their unattended candles burning steadily for no audience at all, the portrait gallery with its dim ovals of long-departed faces watching softly from their gilded frames. Each image now releases you a little more deeply. You do not need to hold any of them. You do not need to remember any of them. They have passed through your awareness like soft drifting clouds across an evening sky, present for a single patient moment, and then continuing on their own slow journey. They asked nothing of you, they demanded nothing, they offered themselves softly into your awareness and then, just as softly, allowed themselves to drift away. The bed beneath you continues its patient cradling, the pillow continues its soft welcoming of your tired head, the coverlet continues its warm acceptance of your slowing breath, the lavender continues its slow herbal fragrance, the candle continues its trembling flame, the clock continues its soft distant ticking. The moonlight continues its gradual paling toward the soft coming dawn. Everything continues patiently without your supervision, without your attention, without any need for your awareness at all. You are safe here, dear listener. You are safe in the long patient night. You are safe in the soft cradling of the bed. You are safe in the slow patient breathing of the great old palace. The walls have held quieter sleepers than yourself across the centuries, and the walls are well practiced at this gentle art of holding. The walls know how to keep you safe through the long, unhurried hours until the soft coming of the dawn. Sleep softly now. Sleep deeply. Sleep without hurry, without worry, without any need to wake before your body is ready. The dust motes will continue their patient drifting. The candle will continue its slow burning. The clock will continue its quiet ticking. The moon will continue her slow descent. The patient palace will continue its long, deep breathing all around you. And you, beautifully, will rest. Sleep softly. Sleep deeply. Sleep, dear listener. Sleep. Welcome to Sleepy History with Henry. Here, we harness AI to breathe new life into authentic historical records, creating an immersive auditory experience. This entire production is AI-assisted, crafted solely for relaxation and sleep support. TAND is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Now, let Henry and AI guide you on a peaceful journey through the past.